everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Artisans and Steel podcast. We have a very special guest today, Mr. Van Barnett, who I'm super excited to speak with. He is a veteran in the knife game. He's been doing this for quite a long time. Got all kinds of experiences in various venues and aspects, and I'm really look forward to talking to him about his approach to knife making. And he's a cool dude, and I look forward to it. But before that, we're gonna get into some sponsor reads real quick. Just to give our sponsors some love. We have the first off at the top of the list, we have Maritime Knife Supply. You can find them on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Maritime Knife Supply. And then they're also online, maritimeknifesupply.com. They have all kinds of knife supplies that you need for knife making. They're actually just getting into the parkerizing game. They have the just started selling the chemicals needed for parkerizing and darkening blades. They also have pre-made stainless steel heat treat foil packs. So if you're getting tired of either having a giant roll rolling around your shop or cutting yourself up building those packs, you can get them pre-formed from Maritime Knife Supply. So go check them out, maritimeknifesupply.com. Next, we have Ben Butcher. He's Amo Bladesmithing. Ben is a great guy. He actually just finished up a felling axe. Looked awesome. He did a great job forging it. In general, he has a really nice kind of forged finish kind of aesthetic. And so go check him out on Instagram. He's AMO Bladesmithing on Instagram. Next up is Gabe Fletcher, Anchorage Brewing, as well as Anchorage Forge. I actually just got back from Anchorage 3 days ago. I'm trying to think what days it is. Yeah, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, whatever. One of those. I spent the week up there teaching with him and working with him. He is a very talented budding maker. He picks up the knife making craft very quickly. He's got a lot of skills from previous life adventures and experiences that help translate really nicely into knife making. And he's doing a great job. He's especially doing a really great job in forging blades and forging Damascus. And I am really excited to see where he goes, because he is already on a pretty fast track making some really great stuff. Next up, we have Tony Sasma. He's TNT Forge. Tony is another great culinary knife maker. He actually has a beautiful, I think it's Go My. So there's 5 different. He's got, what is it? It's random pattern on top of a thick, I think, nickel or 15 and 20 layer on top of a core material, and it's cladded like that on both sides. So you got 5 layers. So that he's got a beautiful Go My blade on his Instagram, and it's available now. But he's also a great guy and a great follow. Go follow him on Instagram at TNT Forge. Next up is Brian Hinnencap of Tortuga Blade Works, who just lives a little bit north of me, and I look forward to seeing him soon. We're gonna get together. He's got a new forge for me. And so he actually, though, he just did the Working For It podcast. And so he's got a great interview on there. Go check it out. Work For It podcast. But you can find him on Instagram and Facebook at Tortuga, Tortuga Blade Works. Tortuga means turtle in Spanish. So go check him out. He's doing some really great work. Next up, we have Mr. Eric Kidwell. Eric Kidwell is just getting back. He's been part of the knife making craft for a while, especially when it comes to the Travis Wirtz hammering and doing a lot of the videography. In fact, all the videography for the hammering for like the last 7 or 8 years. And he's getting into knife making, getting his shop set up. Looks like he was just doing some beer tasting with Will Brigham, some Horace ales from Kyle down there in California. So go check out Eric. He's starting his journey in knife making himself, and you can find him on Instagram at District 202 LLC. Next up, we have Mr. Josh Weston, Josh A. Weston on Instagram. He's also part of the at Dragon Forge EXP, the Dragon Forge experience, where they tour around the country to various Renaissance festivals. And they set up these beautiful dragon forges that they fabricated. They're forges built to look like dragons, and you're forging out of the fire in the mouth of the dragon. And it looks like a lot of fun, and a lot of people are getting to have the forging experience. And so if you ever get a chance and they're going to be near you, go check them out. I look forward to seeing Josh at Blade Show. He's talking to me about maybe trying to join him on his blade making. Every year he does a blade show, blade making challenge thing. I'm only going to be a blade show though for Saturday and part of Sunday. So unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to swing that one this year, but possibly next year because he'll have a whole day up on me. But I look forward to seeing him and hanging out with him. Next up is Mr. Michael Poor. He's Red Dragon Forge at Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. Another great guy. He's not far from me. He's making some great knives. He actually has a really cool gaucho. Well, it's hard to, I can't tell right now if it's a gaucho knife or if it's going to be a culinary knife that he's building or one and the same. But he's got a beautiful blade that he's forged out, and I'm excited to see it come together for him because it is a good looking knife. He's also a great cook. So he's an awesome follow, and if you want to be drooling while you're looking at your phone, he's a good person to be following because he's got tons of great food that he posts up on his Instagram. All right, next up is Mr. Russell Tinsley, Ouzelfinch Beers. His maker page is at Can't Make Knives. Although I've said this before, but I'm pretty sure he's going to have to change that soon. So Ouzelfinch Beers is a brewery over in Virginia, and they make some really crazy out of the box crazy idea like beers. They actually just have a lemon bar beer that they came out with. They have a beer frozen. It's like what is it? It's like daiquiri almost, but it's like some of their beers that they put through the daiquiri machine, and they look super delicious. If you don't have Ouzelfinch beers at your local beer market, go tell the buyer to get some in because they make some really great stuff. They also have the Nost Brewing Project, who are worth checking out and getting some of their beers. They're like, if you can imagine some of the first beers you ever drank in your life, and then imagine them made with really high quality, well sourced, ingredients. It's like an elevated, like for me, it would be like PBR or Olympia beer or Rainier beer, and so it's like along some of the beers are along those lines, but like really good. And then last up we have a new sponsor. We have Dan Hubbs. He's at 66 Mountain Knives. He is a firefighter, and he's looking at growing his knife making knife making side hustle. And he's actually going to be a blade show this year. He's going to be at table 34i, and he's looking forward to connecting with the community and with other makers that are near the top of the game. Yeah, I've had a look at his page. He's doing really good, very clean work. And so give him a follow. He's again at 66 Mountain Knives. So without further ado, we have Mr. Van Barnett in here. I'm going to pull him in actually right now. I'm really excited to talk to Van about his work. He does some wild and crazy, and I hope he doesn't take offense to it because I absolutely love and adore the style that he puts into his knives that is very much his own. And we got a lot of pictures available to us right now to kind of poke through and look at because he does some really wild and crazy stuff. A lot of work with gold and in like set precious stones and engraving work and all kinds of wild shapes that he gets in the steel as well as in the handle materials and stuff. And I really am excited to talk to you, Van, and I'm super thankful for you taking the time to be here with me and chatting with me about, your history, your story, your process, your outlook on life and the craft in general. And I think there's going to be a lot of value for folks in this conversation.
Oh, I hope. I'm glad to be here. I'm really glad you had me over. This is my first podcast, so we'll see how this all goes. Works out pretty well for me.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. You have an interesting story. We've had a few emails back and forth, and you got a wild background and interesting history. And so, actually, if you don't mind, I would love to. I'll try to keep. I have a tendency to like fire a bunch of questions all at the same time, so I'll try to keep it like to one or two. But I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit about your background, what you were like as even just as a child, getting like especially regarding like creativity and art, and what life was like a little bit, and how kind of like these creative endeavors have been nurtured for you throughout your early life, and how that leads into early knife making.
Yeah, sort of like the abridged autobiography.
Yeah.
Huh? I made my first knife in 1974. I had a strange childhood. I was an only child, and I have no brothers, no sisters, no other family members at all now. And uh, I grew up in a unique situation. So I actually started making knives. Made my first knife in 1974 with my grandfather, actually.
Oh wow.
And yeah, it was a hunting knife. And then I didn't make any more knives until 1979. But that first one was, something that keeps you into it. And then I started making a few knives in 1979, 1980. And then I went full time in 1981, late 81, early 82.
Hmm.
So I've been full time, roughly 42 years.
Okay.
And, the first 9 years of my knife making career, I lived in my shop, literally on a cot. There's a lot of things people don't know and understand about my whole life history. So it's been a strange situation for me.
Sure.
Yeah, I've made lots and lots of hunting knives. I made thousands, actually, probably 3,500, 4,000 hunting knives. Yeah, through all those years. That's
That
how
is
you
a
survived.
amazing productivity.
It started, yeah. Well, you're making 25 knives a week and you're selling them for $20 a piece. That's not much. But
Right, okay.
yeah, after you cover supplies and materials and everything else like that, any expenses, you don't have much left over. Plus, at that time, my shop was at my father's house, and I was having to pay him a percentage of everything I made for having the shop there.
I gotcha.
And it was a strange situation.
Sure.
But it's been a fun process, and it's been a long one. You get to see a lot of things come and go in the industry in that period of time. When I first started making knives, I remember I had the Guild Annual, and there were, I think, 94 listed makers in the Knife Makers Guild Annual, and that was nation or worldwide, actually.
Oh, wow,
I'm sure
okay.
there were a lot of unlisted makers, but there weren't very many people in the beginning like that.
Mhm.
And then it starts to change over the years. And I'd say in the last 20 years, we've taken on more people coming into the art of knife making than any other time in history. It's quite fascinating,
For
actually.
sure. When you were so you said you made your first knife when in 1974. How old were you when you made that first knife with your
Oh,
grandfather?
I was 10. I
10
was
years
born
old.
in 1964
Okay,
and grew up just being a little kid playing by myself.
sure.
And I had a lot of creative energy when I was young. I was always into art and thinking and playing alone, and you learn to do a lot of things like that. It's a fascinating thing. Um, I don't know. It's hard to get into those situations, but you know, when I was young, I was diagnosed with Asperger's,
Okay.
and it made me a very different person. So
Mhm.
it makes your mind think about 1,000 things a second,
Sure.
and it's sort of how I do things now. I think about everything in depth, so I build everything in my mind before I do
Mhm.
it. But having this type of advantage versus actually a disadvantage allows you to be super creative in a lot of different areas. So you
Sure.
can be, you're a writer, you're a poet, you're a painter, you're a sculptor, you're a knife maker. You can be about anything you want to be
Mhm.
just by putting your creative energy towards it.
Right.
And it's sort of the way life goes.
When you were young and first exploring your kind of artistic and creative side, maybe a little bit more intentionally, because most kids kind of just like they'll scribble on paper, or not scribble, but they'll draw on paper and stuff. My kid's 6 years old right now, and he does a lot of drawing, but he also does a lot of building with like Legos and stuff like that. And I'm curious if you had kind of a more preferred medium that you worked with when you like, was it sculpting with clay, or was it all of them building stuff, or was it drawing? What are some of those early projects that you might still remember from that time?
Mostly sketching and drawing.
Okay.
I did a lot of drawing in school when I was little, and then I got picked for all the art projects. And
Mm,
so you end up becoming known as the art kid in school. So anything that needs done, you're the one that ends up having to do that. And you do a
that was
lot
me.
of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the way it goes all through school. And things were a little different for me in school, but it was a lot of fun being able to do that. I did a lot of drawing, a lot of sketching, and I used to enjoy taking things apart and putting them back together. That was always a fun process.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about your childhood when I don't have much to relate it to. It's just, I was there, and I created my own worlds in my own mind. It's
Sure.
kind of the way it works. Use your creative energy to do what you can do, even when you're little.
Hmm.
And your imagination, if you have a very vivid imagination, it really increases your creative ability to do a lot of things.
Right.
And that daydreaming thing that kids used to do when they were little, you don't see people doing that much anymore. But that was a big thing to help the creative process in your mind, is being able to daydream and go places in your head and your mind, and
Mm,
and experience things. And whether you're a knight riding a horse with a sword, or you're a cowboy with pistols, or whatever it may
sure.
be in your mind, that's that creative imagination. But that also helps with your ability to do art, and it helps you create things throughout your entire life by being able to do these things. Using your imagination. Art is like that. Art is an imagination project. It's all an illusion,
Yeah.
and the artist is the illusionist, and it's
Sure.
just the way it works. You work with the limbic system, so everything is emotional. The whole point is to create emotions out of physical objects, and
Sure.
that's sort of what I've done my whole life. Being the way I am,
Mm,
I have a hard time with emotions. I don't really feel them, so what I can do
okay.
is share them through what I create. And that's what I've always done. That's why my art's always different. It's always unique, and it's always pretty much uniquely me. It's
Right.
just the way I enjoy doing things. I share who I am through what I make, whatever it is. I mean, I've made so many different things. Knife making just turned into the profession because it was an untouched medium, so to speak.
Hmm.
There's getting into the full-blown art medium to become a painter or a sculptor. There's huge amounts of competition to step into that part of the industry. But
Right.
when you're creative and you can go into any field you really want to go into, the knife making one just became a medium that I really liked playing in. And so I started out making hunting knives, and I've made, like I said, thousands of hunting knives, Bowie knives, anything that cuts. Because when you're doing this for a full-time living, starting out in those days, you'll make anything with an edge that somebody needs. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a
Right.
knife or whether it's
Absolutely.
rooster spurs. And it works out.
Rooster spurs for
Yeah,
cockfighting?
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Holy shit. Okay.
Anything people will pay you for, you'll
Right.
make. It's just the way it is. Or you'll sharpen things or anything like that. I've sharpened so many thousands of knives
Right.
for butchers and things like that.
Yeah.
But it works out okay. But you start out making hunting knives, and then even early on, I made my first art dagger. I actually sent you a picture of that one with pearl. I made that in 1984, I believe. And that was the first step into the art world. And then from then on out, every time I went to a show or did anything like that, I made at least one or two art pieces along with all the hunting knives I would take to sell.
Hmm.
And it lets you visualize what people were interested in certain demographics, and where you were traveling to sell your products and your wares, which in those days was mostly arts and craft shows, and some knife and gun shows.
Okay.
And then the NKCA knife maker shows, knife collector shows started for me in the late 80s. I did my first blade show in 85, I think. We were still in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Okay.
And then I did the blade show for a lot of years, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, and I finally stopped doing the blade show. I
I
didn't
gotcha.
have time.
Sure.
It's just What it's became now is you're doing these really elaborate pieces that take a huge amount of time, and it makes it to where you set everything up to build a certain project, and then trying to step in and do other things around it make it more difficult.
Sure. You said something earlier about kind of creating space or having space for allowing your mind to explore creativity. And I thought that was really interesting because I feel like that's it seems to me that you do a good job with that. But I think a lot of people nowadays, we're so caught up with our kind of rat race in a way. I even find myself caught up with all the different stuff going on. Particularly, I got the business stuff with the knife making, and all the various aspects of that business. But I also have like the family outside of that, and I think I do. I actually, what did I do? I was really struggling to create space for that kind of creative exploration, even like the willingness to try something and make a mistake. And I had to start building it into my work schedule because it just wasn't happening. And the creative aspect of this knife making work was so long gone and lost that it was just grind, 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 grind all the time to pay the bills. And like you were saying, you've made thousands of hunting knives to get by, but you also, it sounds like you found a way to find that balance so that you can still kind of, yeah, have that space for creative exploration in your various endeavors of sculpture and poetry and drawing and knife making. And I wonder how is it that you find that time for yourself, or that you might be able to, I guess, maybe advise people like a younger me even, like how do I find that time for myself, because it is such an important part, and because knife making is such a creative expression, for a lot of people, that that it's important, yeah, I think, to find that time, but where to find it and how to create it is the difficulty I struggle with often.
Yeah, finding time for yourself, I guess, and to find time for your own inner creative energy is a difficult process. My mind is a little different. I like to, I mean, it's easier for me to explain how I do things, and maybe
Sure.
you can get information from that that may
Yeah.
help you in the way you do things. I have a photographic memory for shapes and colors and light and shadow and all that type of thing. And my mind is like a giant white room full of file cabinets, and each file cabinet is 50 feet long, and you can pull them all out, and you can go through
Mm.
anything instantaneously. So
Wow.
it makes it hard for me to have friends and thinking like I do, because what happens is my thought process is so rapid, it's hard to explain to people how it works when you're thinking that fast. But
Mhm.
if I look at something, I build it completely in my mind, do every single step of the process. I mean, drill every hole, cut everything out, and I do that instantly. And I can
Mm.
tell you all the mistakes, and I've tried it multiple ways in my
Mm.
mind. So
Sure.
I've done something, I've cut it this way, and this way. This way is the best way. This way, I actually broke a piece, so that's a dangerous. But all this happens within your mind
Right.
instantaneously. And when that happens, someone says, oh, I wanted to try this. And you go, oh, no, that won't work. Well, and then instantly they're like, what do you mean it doesn't work? And it's like, well, it won't work. And you explain why it won't work. And they'll say,
Sure.
well, but what if I did? Well, no, that won't work either. So that makes you come off sort of like an ass. And
Sure.
it
How
does.
dare you tell me my I
Oh,
don't know
it's
what I'm
terrible.
doing.
Yeah, it's why so many people have a hard time with me, because I can't help it. It's the way my brain thinks. I
Right.
think about 1,000 things a second, and I can't help it. And so it's easier for me just to explain how I do things. As far as the creative process, everything to me is about visual stimulation for the patron or the person.
Mm.
What I'm trying to do is tell a story. So that's what everyone should be trying to do through their work. And to
Sure.
me, all knife makers are artists, whether they want to admit it or not. I mean, there's a lot of people say, oh, I won't, I make hunting knives. That's great. I do too. But you still had thought and stimulation to create that piece.
Mhm.
You had an imagination. You even imagined yourself using it, whether you're gutting an animal, field dressing after you've been hunting, whether you're cutting up vegetables. You have used your imagination of how that should feel, how it should work, how it should feel in your hand, how it should feel to you when you look at it. Everything is
Mhm.
based off of emotion and physical. So you've used your creative imagination and you've used that part of art to make the piece. The whole point of doing that is to share who you are within what you make.
Right.
And it's hard sometimes to get that across to people, sharing who you are and within what you create. So every line and every shape and every shadow has an emotion.
Mhm.
And when people see this, every emotion is a vibrational tune. So picture each shape and each line being a vibration. And what you're doing as the artist is you're tuning all these little vibrations into a harmony that everyone can see and
Oh,
visualize.
interesting. All the different lines and colors and contours are like a symphony.
Everything is a vibration, and all you're doing is tuning it. And it's actually quite simple when you think of it. People make
Mhm.
it really complicated, but it's
Sure.
really a simple process. You're tuning this and you're feeling it as you're tuning it, and it becomes an emotional symphony. And people can see that and they flow through it, and everything works from end to end. I used to have that thing where I always said that, there's stop signs that people put in the middle of their pieces on knives. A lot of
Sure.
times it's at the guard transition between guard and blade. And depending on where you go there, you can take the eye in any direction.
Mhm.
And when you take it in any direction, you take it away from the piece as a whole. I would much rather have someone tell me that's a beautiful knife than I would have them tell me that's great steel, or that handle's pretty, or
Mm.
that guard looks wonderful, or I really like that carving or engraving, because that means they have seen it in separate pieces and not as a whole. And
Sure.
that's where the real emotion is in the whole. It's complicated because everyone works within the limbic system, the emotional side with whatever you do. And it doesn't matter what you create, whether it's art, knives, painting, sculptures, writing. I mean, anything you do, you're using your creative energy. And there's a way to tune that and harmonize everything you do to where people will feel what you say or do, or
Sure.
what you produce or anything you create. For me, there's things like, you know, craftsmanship is creating precision with lines and shapes. And
Mhm.
art is creating lines and shapes with emotion. And there's a little bit of a difference. And there is. And it's I don't know how to explain anymore. The only thing I can do is tell you how I do things and
Right.
let you draw from those conclusions of what you can go with.
No, I think that's great. No, I really like that, and I've never really thought about it that way, but I do. I feel like I follow what you're saying because the way for me it is also important, like the lines flow really nicely, the different aspects of the knife flow really nicely together and kind of create kind of an overall composition that presents very nicely. And then if somebody wants to like dive in a little bit deeper into different aspects, then that's great. Um, but yeah, overall, I'm wanting it to be a visually appealing, interesting thing that somebody that could, and, people do put knives on shelves, but at the same time, you know, picking it up and holding it and looking at all those different aspects in closer detail and how they relate to each other and how they flow together is also really important to me,
Yeah.
and I think is really valuable in the creation of a thing.
Yeah. Everything is a three-dimensional object. So for knives, to me, there is no one side or a
Mhm.
presentation side.
Yeah.
It all has to be visually pleasing. So no matter how you hold it, turn it, or feel it with your touch or your eyes,
Mhm.
everything has to be flowing and working in with each other. Um,
Oh, sorry, you're breaking up just for a second. Oh, crap.
yeah, I saw network is based.
Oh yeah, it just dove down for a second. Hopefully it'll come back up.
Much back up.
Um, okay. Sorry, yeah, if you could back up a few sentences. You were yeah, and just kind of go from
Am I
yeah, what's going on? It looks like the connection is a little slow right now on your side. We'll just give it a second.
yeah.
Um, if anybody is in the chat, real quick, if you want to jump in and say hi, but also if there's any questions that come up while you are watching the conversation, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll kind of interject those where they fit. And then yeah. So I think we're back
Yeah.
up though, Van.
I apologize for that speed. It may be on my end. I'm just seeing how everything is slow here. We live way out in the country. So sometimes we have great internet speed and sometimes it can drop down. And I went to the
Yeah.
I switched networks
It's
that I was on.
yeah, it's completely understandable. Sometimes it's depending on the time of day too. It just vacillates back and forth, whether it's really strong or kind of weak. Oh, Mr. Ben Butcher's in the house as well as Mike Poor. Thank you guys for jumping in here. Okay, so let's see. I think you started to break up just after I was talking about like the flow, or you were talking about three-dimensional objects.
Right.
Yeah, so if you want to pick up from there.
Everything is a three-dimensional. So to me, there is no one side or a show side to a piece. Just in my own personal preference, I like for everything to be three-dimensional all the way around. So anywhere you look at it, any angle you look at it, it all still flows perfectly together. And working knives and functional knives and everything like that, they're still all art, and people like them to be visually pleasing, and they should be. And the overall flow of a piece from one end to the other is, I guess, the most important to a lot of people with what they see, because a lot of people seem to talk about the flow and the lines and how things are pleasing. And to me, that's what makes things pleasing for people, is the overall shape and flow. Plus, then you get into the detailed areas that blend together, which, patterning in steels and certain handle materials and certain grain structures, whether you have carving or engraving and other things like that in other materials. So you can take things apart and go through processes, and then also surface treatments and things like that, and other things, embellishments that you've done to a piece. But in the whole, it's the basic lines that give you the canvas to paint on.
Absolutely.
And from there out, you can do anything you want as long as you have a clean foundation. It's very difficult to make things look beautiful if you don't have an original foundation, because you can pile all kinds of things if you were building a house on a terrible foundation, and it'll be beautiful, but it'll crumble because people won't feel it and see it or be attracted to it the way you think they should be because of what you put into it.
That's interesting. I feel like I do see people throw flashy things onto their knives, but it doesn't it looks like simply for the effect of it being fancy or flashy rather than it actually suiting the overall composition of the build. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, I guess, these days. It's a way of people how can I say this, putting themselves into their work with what they think it should do, like adding gemstones and gold parts and miscellaneous things to a piece that doesn't really work with those types of materials. And that's like putting things on them just for putting them on sake, so to speak. It's I don't know. Everyone has their own opinion of art. That's the whole point about creative energy. You can use it, and the beauty of the art's always in the eye of the beholder, never in the creator himself. Everybody has their own visual of what the type of visual stimulation they like to see or feel. A lot of people, and most people, put their own selves into their knives and their own knife craftsmanship You do that. I'm sure you look at things and the lines are pleasing to you, but you also want them to be pleasing to other people.
Absolutely.
And that just comes in going back into the harmony of remembering lines. Each line, each curve is a vibration. And if you
Hmm.
start using those vibrations and tune it to where everything works together and has equal amounts of each within the piece, it all works to the public too. And
Yeah.
you can make something that's just a single piece of steel with nothing on it and make it extremely attractive. And people will just want to have that. And sometimes they don't even know why. You know,
Hmm.
a lot of people enjoy pieces that they see without knowing why. For me,
Sure.
I like telling a story in what I do. I make pieces. That was the whole point behind the time machine pieces that I did
Hmm.
was short-lived. I wasn't going to do them forever. I wanted to do something new and different for a short period of
Yeah.
time. But I created a story, and but I only shared a piece of the story. So the people started sharing and created the rest of the story themselves within their own imagination
Right.
around their own experiences in life and things that they have done. And that allows them to become part of the story that you've created through your own artwork. And this doesn't matter what it can be any type of artwork. It doesn't have to be, some really weird looking knife that most people think, what the hell are you going to do with that thing?
Sure.
But it's true.
Yeah.
Or it can be anything. It can be a simple hunting knife or a kitchen knife. The same person will pick up that piece and you've given them an introduction to a story, and they will take that and they'll picture using it for whatever they use it for in their
Hmm.
mind. And they'll do that within their own imagination. And that lets them become part of what you've created. So they share your art with you that way.
Mm.
It,
Yeah.
it
So it's your creation, or they're using their imagination in combination with your creation to kind of round out that whole kind of creative experience and interaction between you and the patron or the customer.
right. You've started a story, and
Yeah.
um, they're taking it and going within their own mind to finish it out in their own way,
Oh,
and
interesting.
they draw their own conclusions. It's just the way art works in the energy system. I have notes. I'm trying to think what I was going to say about that, but I went so many different places. The creative side of everyone. How can I say this? It's the lines and shapes that you share. People have their own vibrational definitions for everything.
Mm.
So everything has a vibration, but it's different to each person. So everyone sees things differently. And that's just the way it is. Everyone says, well, you'll have to look at it from my point of view. And it's like, I can't. I can only see it from mine.
Right.
So yours is always going to be different. The object you try to do with what you create is to go at it from multiple facets. So you create multiple different things for a large body of people to visualize. It's like writing a story or painting a picture or anything like that, that you
Mm.
want to have a large amount of people attracted to with what you do.
Yeah,
But we're
brought it.
getting into the art side of it, and I
Sure.
apologize for that. I'm getting
No, you're
away from the
perfect.
knife thought process.
It's good. We actually have a couple questions here that came up regarding kind of design and materials, kind of since that's where we're at, kind of like the initial planning and stuff like that. And Mike Poor is asking, "Hi Van, how do you go about choosing materials?" Here, I'm actually going to pop it up onto the screen. How do you go about choosing materials for your projects, whether it be gold or garnet, etc.? Is it client preference or is it strictly your own persuasion? So I guess that's an interesting question too. Is are you building things from your own imagination and bringing them into the world? Are they commission pieces? Is there some interaction with that customer or potential client or patron who's in mind, or you just go with it?
Everything's basically imagination.
Okay.
I design lots of pieces, and both of us do when we do the collaboration pieces with me and Delana both, Delana and myself.
Yeah.
And I just basically get a feeling and emotion from the person that you're designing whatever it is for. Most people will say, I want you to build me something, and you'll go on what little bit you know about that person's personality, and you design from there
Sure.
and go with it. But most things are, I try to never duplicate anything, with the exception of the time machines, and all those were different. I did do 15 of those total, were all different.
Hmm.
4 of the suspension pieces and stuff like
Oh wow.
that. Anyway, the creative side of it is using your imagination to design, and then lay it out through depth and shadow and light, and what works with negative space and non-negative space. And the materials are basically a price gauge, so to speak, for me.
Okay.
You ask somebody what they're wanting to do with what, and you talk about gold, you offer multiple materials. And you have to, because you can't just say it's all this and this is it, because a lot of people may want things done in silver or steel or Damascus or blued steel and gold or miscellaneous pieces like that. But designing full-blown designs and showing people what I have to offer in multiple different areas. So I'll maybe do a dagger and a folding knife design, and I'll do something that's a large dagger and maybe a fighting type piece or anything like that.
Yeah.
And you show that to the people who are interested in seeing, or they're wanting to purchase something, because most people don't know what they want, because if you
Sure.
don't have a specific style or model, they basically just have you make something or design something for them.
Right.
And the whole point is to understand a little bit, try to ask people, what are their favorite colors and things like that, just so you don't get things that people are, disagree with. But
Sure.
gemstones, if they like diamonds and gold.
Okay.
And then the rest of it's just designing lines and shapes, but and putting them together so they work.
Does color theory or kind of complementary colors or any of that kind of stuff kind of play a role in how you decide if a customer, say a customer says, I like, for example, from Mike's question, I love garnets, I love gold, the rest is you.
Right. Yeah, actually, that would work well as far as color, because you'd have the deep reds and the garnet, or the
Yeah.
maroon colors, and you could work that in, but you have to look at your base material and what you're going to be putting it on.
Hmm.
If you're setting stones like that, they would probably be tube set. And so you would have either a gold or silver ring around each stone. So you allow for that.
Mm,
So that breaks up the monotony of just a stone directly to material.
sure.
And with you break up everything, a border, separate out. Visually, that becomes an extra part of someone's visual stimuli. So they look at
Sure.
that, they see the breakup, and it doesn't become separate or blended in and not visualized or not seen at all.
Hmm.
Um, there's so many, when you're talking about designing, but to the lines and shadows, and lots of different frequencies that you can work with that flow. And when I design, I start with an overall outline, I modify that, and then I'm looking at it visually in dimensional shape. But I do very rough sketches. So I
Okay.
have someone who is seeing something, which do a couple sketches that delineated computer that we have to do for people, so they and what the finished piece will look close to the process.
I see.
But for me, when I'm building something, I don't have any other sketches, just a rough one, and then all of it's in here, and you
Mm,
just see it as you go, and you have
yeah.
to invent things and change things. And most sketches never end up being exactly like the finished piece. It's rare that that ever happens, because
Sure.
things have to change as you're creating along the way, because you look at
Right.
light and shadow, and you need light and shadow and depth and three-dimensionality, and you have to be able to put all these things together so it doesn't become a flat two-dimensional object. When you're talking about an art piece, in a functional knife, it can be two-dimensional and still be totally pleasing, so that's
Right.
okay. But that's I know I probably did not even come close to answering any of those questions,
No,
because my
I
mind
thought that
wandered
sounded great.
off into
No, 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 that
a
was
world of
perfect.
nowhere.
I think that was great. Ben has a question here too. He says, "Do you use the golden ratio when you're designing, or do you tend to rely on your intuition and natural perception of proportion? So price in regards to like flow of lines. I guess also another thing to add to that list of things, like maybe a French curve or something like that, or is it, or are you just kind of going kind of with a more natural intuition, like he's asking here?"
Yeah, I've never used the golden ratio.
Okay,
I have French curves that I draw with as far
sure,
as shaping out certain curves and lines so everything flows in one piece, but that's
yeah,
mainly to help doing sketches if I have to show someone a picture of something.
right,
But no, I've never used the golden ratio. To me, uh, having the photographic memory of lines and shapes, it makes everything kind of blend together in my filing cabinet brain,
yeah,
and you can go through things rapidly and see what shape works and what doesn't. I mean, the slightest adjustment of a line can change the whole visual of an
right,
entire piece with one little tiny line right at the guard,
mm,
or somewhere else. But most times, tiny changes in ricasso areas and things like that on knives can change the whole visual appeal of the knife because it
right,
allows your eye to flow through it instead of stopping there.
right,
And that's where most people seem to have the most problem with anything they create is at that changeover point from either guard, bolster, or anything to blade. It's in
yeah,
that area that there's about a 1.5 square inch area right there that everybody seems to have a lot of either perfectly done, or if you get it off the tiniest bit, everything stops right there. It does.
right. It
It's just
distracts the eye. Yeah.
it's a stop sign. And no matter how much people say, oh, it doesn't, it does. It really makes a difference in how people visualize what they're holding in their hand or what they're seeing on your table if you're at a show
Sure.
or something like that. It's the overall flow. And I've shown that to a lot of people by taking something they've done and changing one line, and I mean just a tiny bit, taking it from a slight straight line to a little bit of a curve,
Yeah.
and it changes everything. It's just it's the way it works.
Yeah.
Simple. Everything is really simple. People make things too complicated. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be complicated.
I I agree. I actually I try to do everything I can to keep my knives as simple, at least simple looking as possible. It is a kind of convoluted, complicated route that I go about getting to that result, but everything I try to do, I try to keep it. It is kind of wrapped around the idea of the illusion of simplicity and kind of a natural sense to the thing when it actually was kind of like it was a lot of work to get to that thing. And I feel like some of the most some of the most beautiful things I've seen, whether it's in ceramics or paint or in knives or whatever, um, they appear simple, but when you look closer, you can see how challenging and complex and difficult, and how much skill it took to complicate or to not complicate, but um, to bring that thing together. Oh, I hear a kitty.
Yeah.
Meow.
Yeah. One
Uh,
of my two children.
nice. And yeah, and it's just to like complete and bring that thing together so that it becomes what it is. And even though it may look simple, it's actually incredibly and extremely complex in the execution and completion of that project.
Yeah. Depth and everything has a feeling or an emotion. And
Mm.
um, the,
Oh shit! It just froze again. Damn it. Hopefully he'll it's just the I think it's the internet, and it just again, this is just something that happens from time to time. And like he said, he's in a somewhat of a rural area, and he'll get back in here again. Um but it's just even on my side, honestly, this happens often. When I'm doing other podcasts, I'll dive in and out, and it just depends on again timing of day and location. But he's back in, and his connection looks perfect.
yeah, it's weird because I didn't lose it on my end. It stayed at 10 for some strange reason.
Oh,
Because I went over to the 5G network here at the house. So
okay.
I did that earlier. I apologize.
No,
Okay.
it
What
looks
was you
great now.
saying? What were you saying?
Um, we
Again,
were I was talking about like the simplicity of things, and you began talking about kind of depth. Um,
Oh, yeah.
and where
Making
and
everything the simplicity. Yeah.
mm,
Everything really is simple. It's all lines and shapes. That's really all anything is. It's just lines and shapes, and the rest of it's creative emotion. You're putting emotion into pieces. So you're taking lines and shapes and making them into an object that you want other people to feel, and you want to feel good about yourself. That's about as simple as you can make it.
right.
Whether you're sketching those lines on a piece of paper, or you're turning them to a sculpture, or a knife, or any other product that you want to create with your hands or your mind or your emotion. Um, you know, it's physical objects from the mind with a breath of life from the soul. So that's kind of how it works. You create these things, and then you breathe life into it with your own creative energy, and
Yeah.
it becomes an extension of you, and people see that. And I'm not meaning to get into the art side. I know I'm trying to keep my brain on the knife side.
Oh, you're good.
The it's all about the simplicity of why you do what you do. Sharing emotions through things. That's what everyone does. Everyone shares their feelings. It is that simple. Whenever you
Yeah.
make something, you've thought about using it in 100 new different ways, and that's allowed you to share how it feels to you in your mind and in your hand
Yeah.
and in function. Whether it's functional or not, it doesn't matter. It all comes from the same place, which is within here,
Yeah.
and that's what you're really wanting to share with people.
It's something that I kind of I wish I should intentionally reflect on more frequently because it is really, I feel like, a very unique thing, especially more and more these days, for a person to imagine a thing and then manifest it through their hands and through materials and removing materials or adding materials to sculpt and create an object that started in here and now is in the physical world.
Right?
Sometimes I reflect on it and think it's like a fucking trip. It's like it
Exactly.
was here and now it's here, and hopefully somebody's interested in it or it can help pay my bills. And I struggle with the whole aspect of it being like, because every piece well, not necessarily every piece, but most pieces I build feel like they are a part of me. That object has been imbued with
Yeah.
some of my essence, I guess, in a way, especially when it comes like my imagination or my creativity, and putting that out into the world is a very vulnerable thing. And I often struggle with the business side of the knife making, because it is an essential aspect so that I can continue to do the work, right?
Exactly.
And I'm curious, how do you kind of find balance and interact with that kind of aspect of the craft, in this art?
For me, it's all I've ever done.
Mhm.
So that part is kind of it's just natural. You
Okay.
you have to create. It's either create or die. Literally, that's
Sounds
what
like
it
a
is.
t-shirt waiting to happen.
Yeah, pretty much.
I bet it's out there already. Create
It
or
should
die.
exactly.
I love
Well,
it.
that's why you're here. You're here to create. That's what
Yeah,
you are, as part of source creative energy, and everything you do is part of you, spread throughout the world to share who you are and
sure.
experience. And other people are meant to experience you, and each person does that through what they create.
Yeah.
You experience other people with what you visualize and what they say, do, make, write. It's all like that. You're experiencing that person. Now, that's in a physical sense, and even in, but when you get into movies, you get actors, people who portray other things and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that is what you're doing. They're wanting you to experience something. So
Yeah.
they portray multiple things. Being an artist allows you to be, like I've said before, the illusionist, and you're creating art
Mm.
and emotion through physical objects that you're sharing with people that you want them to see part of you that you maybe can't share on your own.
Mm.
But going on with the business side of this, and the having done this my whole life, I've never had another job. So I had to start out making things from nothing, and then gradually get to where you're able to survive a little more. I mean, living in your shop for many, many years. I was almost 9 years, sleeping on a cot and eating canned stuff that you heated in your kiln. because I was lucky enough to have a kiln in the beginning. My father
Sure.
had bought some knife equipment from someone in the 70s
Mm,
and never used it. And then I started playing with that. And after my first knife in 74 with my grandfather, that was all done with a regular grinder and a buffer and the hand files. And
okay. Like a bench grinder?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It was
Wow.
done with a bench grinder and then the files and sandpaper after that. It was a very simple piece.
Yeah.
But I still have it and still use it. So, uh,
Wow. That's
yeah,
awesome. That's
yeah, still
incredible.
have my very first knife. That's the one I managed to keep. And I still got it after all these years. But the making life with your own hands allowed me to be very creative because I had to be. Yeah, I had to make all kinds of different things. And you have to have a creative imagination because if you stick early on, especially for me, where I live in the country, it's and in traveling around, even in that time frame, knives weren't, people were like, you do what? When you say you're a knife maker, and they would. They would
Are
be
you
like,
a psychopath? Are
that's
you
it.
wanting to kill me or something?
You're a knife, what? And I'm like, yeah, I make knives. Or then you start saying that you're a steel artisan, and that seems to work a little bit better.
Mm,
In the early times,
sure.
now it doesn't matter. Knife making's a known
Right.
thing worldwide. It's pretty cool, but you're learning to make everything that you can to sell stuff. So it allows you to be creative and design things that are appealing to people instead of trying to compete at a market share that everybody's doing the exact same thing and you have to tell them why yours is better.
Mm,
And that's a very difficult thing to do. If
it
you're
is.
making something that
Yeah.
is identical to 50 others that are there beside you at a show,
Mhm.
and the only thing you have is your verbal ability to tell people this is better than that one over there. This is why you should buy this one and not that one. Even though you're not saying that
Right.
bluntly, in your mind, that is what you're thinking. I want you to
Right.
buy this and not that. You know, and people need to be honest with that because it's really what they're doing. They're there
Right.
saying, I want you to buy this, don't buy that one. But of course, you don't disparage someone, you don't say anything. It's just
Sure.
that you have to make yours different and more desirable.
Yeah.
And that becomes a process. And that's where you come in using your mind and your thought.
Sure.
And that comes in with changing little lines and little shapes and little things to give your piece depth and three dimensionality
Right.
and body and life and emotion. And once you
Mhm.
do that, people will see it and you'll notice it when you're at a show. You'll have something on your table that you'll see 50 people come by and everyone looks at that one piece
Mm.
and they're like, wow. And you have to look at it yourself and you may not understand what's different about that compared to this. Well, look at it. The way I always do it is, especially early on and still to this day, I do a mirror test. I take a finished piece once it's done and I hold it in the mirror. And I do that not just to see me in there, because that does help you when you see you and your piece and you know how people see what you are, what
Sure.
you've created. But it also allows you to see from a different point of view. You're looking at it from the outside in when you're
Mm.
looking at your reflection in the mirror. And it allows you to see it from a patron's perspective.
Oh, interesting.
And it does.
I've never even thought about that, but that's exactly what you're seeing in the mirror is what a potential
They
client is
see.
seeing when you're standing behind the table
Exactly. And
and
that
holding a
is
piece.
what you do. Whether you're holding it or it's sitting down, it doesn't matter. It's a different point of view. And the
Yeah.
mirror is the easiest way to achieve that different point of view.
Right.
Even if you walk around and look at the table yourself in the front, it's not the same. It
Right.
is not the same as looking in the mirror while you're there within that same picture because it
Yeah.
allows you to see it from the outside in and you see what other people see. And you can see if you're in your work. You'll see your face and your representation, and you'll see your lines and shapes and your shadows and your negative space, and everything's there in front of you. What you've created, even
Right.
in your patterning of your steel work and everything that you've put into it's right there. And if it all harmonizes with you while you're looking in the mirror, then it works, and you'll know it works. You'll feel it because it'll have the emotional pop. And I'm not talking about this extravagant art piece. I'm talking about a simple functional piece that
Mhm.
works visually, and you'll see it yourself and you'll
Sure.
feel it and you'll say, oh yeah, that's a cool one, people are going to love that, and they will, because
Mm.
you've also put that into it and it becomes appealing and desirable.
I gotta
And
try that.
It works quite well, actually. It's a fascinating thing to do. So always do it the mirror test. It's a very important thing to do, actually. It
I've never
allows
even
you,
heard that before. I
yeah,
love that.
I've always done that. It allows you to see yourself in your work.
Yeah,
That's kind of what I preach about all the time is allowing people, like through all the details posts and things I've done over the years, is allowing people to see you in your work. And the one way you can see you in your work, honestly, is to hold it in front of a mirror. And there you are. You're there
sure.
with it. And it allows you to compare everything. It's just a different way to visualize it. For some reason, it takes you out of your head when you see your own reflection in the mirror and allows you to see it from an opposite point of view.
Yeah. Your
And it,
work is oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. That was it.
Okay. Your work, and I feel like I said this earlier in the introduction, but I feel like your work is very uniquely you and your style, which is kind of what we're talking about. And we'll go through some pictures later. And I would love to hear you talk about and to kind of describe the different pieces. And I'm curious when you were first starting out, and you've said a few times like you have this file cabinet of images and shapes and contours, and different lines and combinations of elements and materials and colors that is a source material for you to kind of pull from. Um, are there, you know, I I feel like asking about early inspirations because your work is so unique is kind of a weird question to ask you, but were there, whether it was s- um there were things described through words in books and stories and poetry, or if it was visual paintings or other sculpture, that really that stand out to you as things that were attractive to you, that you related to so strongly and felt yourself within, that you that help maybe kind of influence the way you create the work that you create.
Yeah, I wish I had a list of people and things I could say that about. But
Sure.
as far as in the knife making world, my early experience with other people when I first started making knives, I had no clue there were other knife makers.
Sure.
I had no clue. I did not
Oh,
know that.
apparently
And
people you were telling that didn't know that either because they thought
yeah,
you're crazy for making that.
exactly. That's it. I didn't know at the time
Yeah,
because when you're doing craft shows and things in your local
right,
area, in this area, there aren't many other knife makers doing that type of a show like there would be now. I mean, you can see a
right.
lot of people when you go to shows now.
Yeah.
So, inspirational stuff, not knowing much about it, to me, it was just a new way to do different things. I
Mhm.
wish I would have maybe, well, maybe not though. Had I been around other people early on, or had I been taught or shown by someone, it may have altered the way I went in my
Sure.
entire thought process about how to do things, because I invent things myself of how I need to do. I look at something, and if I need something, I'll make something to make that thing with, or make
Right.
that shape, or make that angle. Because I
Mhm.
do everything by hand. I don't have CNC machines and anything like that.
Sure.
And I do have a milling machine, but I have never milled anything but a guard with it. I
I got
haven't.
you.
I've milled slots and guards for hidden tang daggers, but
Sure.
other than that, I've never milled anything. Oh, I take that back. I milled one folder handle in the '80s when I did one of my first folders. I did a
With like the
eighth inch
inlay.
piece of stainless. Yeah, yeah, I did a cavity inlay in a couple of those.
You didn't wanna cut that out by hand?
No, I did my very first one by hand. I did. I did the first one with a hand saw and
Whew.
I mean a jeweler
That was
saw and a file, and cut it out of 3/16 440C,
mhm.
and that took forever. And then I took a
How's
drill
that?
with a rotary burr
Okay.
and ground it with a rotary burr in and out that way to finish it off. That was my
Yeah.
my very first folding knife was an interframe.
Mhm.
Yeah, with an inlay with two pearl inlays. And the thing was is it wasn't cavity. It went all the way through. Didn't know
Oh,
any other way to do it. I'd never
sure.
seen the inside of one of the inlays, and it's just the way it goes. Live
Yeah.
and learn. And I had to put a liner inside of it, so I had to cut a cavity on the inside to make sure my liner um, covered up the base of the pearl that was on the inside of the handle scales.
Right.
Anyway, I've gotten totally sidetracked. Where were we at now?
Just, like, early inspirations, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be other knife makers, just other art out in the world that you've experienced and you feel like kind of touched you or that you connected with that maybe has helped to inspire your approach to your knife making?
Yeah, mostly for me, the inspiration is within everything.
Hmm.
Trees and mountains and houses and lines and shapes. And the file cabinet situation I have in my head means I have, it's a weird thing, the ability to remember every shape I've ever seen in my
Sure.
entire life. So, as crazy as that sounds, they're there. And
Yeah.
you shapes and shadows in a way that my
Oh, we're losing you again. If I don't know if you can hear me. We're gonna pause for a second. Hopefully it'll come back. The screen is kind of paused and but it's all right. It should come back in just a second. Um I'll talk for a second while it tries to come back. I also I find shapes in nature and everywhere, even in patterns I see in floor carpeting and wallpaper and drapes um and in the pattern of like even the coloration of bird feathers on a wing or something like that always strike me as very interesting when it comes to especially when it comes to pattern welding design and developing different Damascus. Um, but I'm really intrigued to hear more. Let's see if we got Vince back. You want to try talking, chatting, or continuing where you're at?
we can track and on my end is terrible for a strange reason. 10 and now I'm down to 2.
Yeah.
Am I breaking up?
Um, a little bit,
Yeah, it's going to
but
probably get worse.
I can hear you actually pretty clear. If we can, um,
Yeah. I apologize for the connection.
no, you're
It's
good, and it looks like it's coming back up. Um, so
the
you're
internet for some reason gets slow out here at certain periods of the day, but usually not
yeah,
on a weekday. Um,
sure,
our problem is where we live. We are next to the last house out with cable,
okay.
and so
You're at
that
the end of
makes
the
it
line.
absolutely.
You're getting the last little drop of internet out there.
Yeah, we actually have to pay for the extra boost, and they finally got that up, so we should be well 400 times. Not the yeah. If we lose video, like somebody said, there maybe the audio will still come through. We'll see. My signal
Yeah,
is down.
we could try doing that if you like. Because you'll still be able to see the screen, even if I pop up images and stuff like that.
Right,
So we could try that if you're. I
I'm
mean, it
fine.
seems all
Whichever way
right
you
right
want to go.
now.
I'm just
It
still
seems all right
trying.
right now
Right, for the moment, right now. Yeah,
for the
yeah.
moment. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm in
we'll see
yellow
where we're
with
at in
3
about 20
bars.
minutes.
Connection to 10, so that's too bad. But it should be green and 10 out of 10 for some strange reason. Earlier, when
Yeah.
we lost me, it must have been on the other end because mine was green the whole time, but now it's yellow
Mm,
on my end.
yeah.
I
Well,
apologize.
no, you're good. Yeah, let's try if down in your corner with the next to the microphone, you can disable the camera.
Okay.
We'll try that, and then,
Okay. Now,
hopefully
am I
I can
breaking up?
no, you sound great.
Okay. That's fine. Nobody needs to see me anyway. They've already saw me. It's good enough.
Um, so you were discussing, seeing, like, we were talking about inspirations and seeing, like, inspiration in everything and in nature and mountains and trees, and then it started to break up kinda around there.
Right. Lights and trees. It started out for me, I guess. Maybe that's what we can talk about in that situation as far as the inspiration. Lines
Sure.
and shapes. There's always more below the surface than above. So what happens is if you can relate that, I mean, here we go into it's
Let's hear it.
using the trees are as much or more with the maybe well actually no in times too everything flows in a in a fluid motion. So
Mm.
everything's continuous. There is no actual stop sign like you would think about with a tree. And I used to get inspiration from lines and shapes that way. Clouds, sky formations, multiple
Sure.
different ways. River, the way the water flows, and the way things flash and glitter, and rocks sticking out of the water allows you to visualize shadows and light. And it's
Hmm.
just, it all works. So what happens for me is I have that recorded in my head. So I put all these little pieces together. And so when I see things, it's very difficult to explain. I see things in multi facets. So you look
Yeah.
at light and depth and shadow and negative space all at once. So when I look at anybody's work or anything that they've done, or anybody, everybody does it with your faces and pictures, and everything you see in life is all about line
Sure.
and shape. So those, I guess, are mainly what the inspirations are, is remembering all those lines and shapes that you've seen
Mm.
your entire life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when I'm when I'm sometimes when I'm making Damascus patterns, especially early on, um, when I was kind of just shooting in the dark and trying and experimenting things, um, unexpected shapes would be created, and but within those, I was able to identify things that I had seen before. And honestly, a lot of my patterns, especially early on, had kind of water themed names because a lot of the movement kind of reminded me of images I'd seen or clouds swirling around and storms and stuff like that, or waves crashing up on a beach. And so I tried to once I saw that within the material I was starting to make, then I would try to roll with that and take it and emphasize it to really kind of drive home and kind of create kind of that story that you're talking about when you're making your pieces, um, to really help kind of give something a sense of theme and continuity in a way.
Yeah, and what you were doing right there was putting emotion into your work. You
Mm,
were sharing what you experienced with what you were creating, and
yeah,
you were drawing on your own imagination and memory of past visualizations of formations, art, lines, shapes, wind,
sure.
water, everything. It's all creative energy. Everything, like I said before, is the vibrational energy. Everything's vibration. Every line, every shape, everything you see is created vibrational energy and
Hmm.
created by vibrational energy. And then putting everything together is harmonizing and tuning those. So it's like taking strings of a guitar or something like that and tuning
Mm,
each individual one so they all sound good together.
right.
It all works the same way. And you can tune yourself with the work that you make by understanding how each line feels to people. And you just explained doing that. It's hard to explain how to do it, but you just did. You stated how you did it and how you see things, and you see fluid and water, and it reminds you of the mountain streams and the rivers and things like that. And
Hmm.
what you've done is you've tuned through your own visual experience what you've made into a object and a name, because most people have to have names even if you don't give it to the public. You know,
Sure.
you still create names for things in your mind because that's how you store all the information. It's like building a little file inside your head that you keep that information in, of every line,
Yeah.
every shape, every flowing motion of a piece, everything you've ever created. And you store it, and then you can go in some pieces of that if you ever need.
Sure.
Because if you have one thing that was successful here, you can always go back on that and say, okay, that was successful. What parts of that were the most successful to you?
Mm,
And you look at those parts and pieces and you think, okay, that line and that shape there. Now, how can I that same area in a and create shapes that will work in the same way that did, with duplicating those lines and shapes? Some
yeah.
part. It's a difficult process to make one standard thing and then just have different handle material or different blade material on the same thing over.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I'm kind of reflecting on some of the conversations and questions I've had on my other podcast, and I've talked podcast, when it comes to excuse me, when it comes to design, or people asking, what can I do to make my work stand apart? Um, I think, like we were talking about earlier, it's about kind of creating a space of vulnerability where you feel safe and free to experiment and create without any judgment. And it's through that time that you give yourself, I think, that you start to find you in the work that you're creating. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes time. Um, finding yourself in your work is the main thing, because that's the first step in the process of becoming seen, so to speak.
Mm,
You find your, you know how to show yourself to other people, but you have
sure.
to first find yourself in your work. You can't wander around aimlessly just making things that look like everybody else's. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm getting at is that to become an individual and stand out, there has to be a reason to stand out.
Mm,
And finding yourself in your work means those little added things, whether it's in steel making or whatever it is you do, the little added flair that you add that becomes you alone.
yeah,
Just you do that.
sure.
Because in certain genres of knife making, you are meant to do specific sizes and shapes and styles, and there's not much limitation. You're not like unlimited. You can create anything you want if you're trying to
Yeah,
sell a certain product for a specific type of use. So there is the difference there in the art side, like I do, where I create a lot of things differently. They're still functional, and they are, with the exception of solid gold blades. Those, it's just one of those situations. But
sure.
yeah, you can't sharpen them. Um, but you have to make things that are still functional, but yet still appealing to the.
Right.
It's into whether to just and go that way, or whether you want to share part of yourself. There's two different ways of looking at this type of work in this business, and a lot of people look
Yeah,
at it from one or the other, and there's a few who look at it from both points of view.
sure.
You look at it in the business side of saying, do I just want to make money and be done with it and sell what I make, or do I want to sell what I make but also become noticed and known and seen for what I make?
Sure.
And there is a, and it depends on how you visualize it from your own personal needs or desires.
Sure.
you know
It's like striking a balance. You always hear about these different balances of work and life, and I guess from the creative perspective, it's figuring out if, yeah, like you were saying, am I here to make money? Am I also here to also nurture kind of a creative nature that's within me to share and put out into the world.
Right. Yeah. Everyone, I mean, there's always a desire to survive and eat, and you have to
Sure.
do that unless you're
Yeah.
lucky enough to not have to do that. And I don't know too many people, although, most people at least have some other source of income, which helps. But boy, if you don't, it can be really rough on you. It
It
can,
is rough.
yeah,
I am one of the people who does not have an alternate source of income, so
exactly.
everything I'm doing with the knife making, um, is all about, yeah,
Right.
doing both
And
of those things, surviving as well as nurturing that creative, need for, or that need for creative expression that's, like,
absolutely.
reverberating within me.
Yeah, you have to do that. You
Yeah,
have to you have to nurture your own creative energy within, because it gets back to that statement of create or die.
right.
What happens if you don't share your creative energy? And if you are a person who is in touch with your creative energy within yourself and you do not share it, then you'll start noticing multiple facets of depression and many other things that can
Sure.
happen to you if you don't share it. You have to share it.
Yeah, and that's honestly to get a little bit personal on my end. That's something that I've been working through, I feel like, for the last and trying to really kind of answer over the last couple of years. Because while I have ideas of how to just like make money, like all these different ideas of designs for things and make money, at the same time, I really struggle with it because it it doesn't really nurture that creative side of things, and sometimes I do kind of meditate on that question of like, what is the value of the things that I'm creative, or me just of creative expression in general, and sharing that stuff with the world. And I think um and hopefully I'm not the only one that struggles with trying to figure that out and answer that question of why, but I've started to come up with an answer, that it is it's about you do it for yourself, but you're also doing it for each other. We do it for each other. Musicians do it for us, actors, artists, painters, um, other knife makers, sculptors. It helps to see the beauty that's in the world, that is able to uh, come from us and be a reflection of us, that helps to inspire each other and to help each other, and inspire not necessarily even for people to make knives. Like for me, I make knives. Like I have this set of skills and knowledge and understanding, and my medium is making knives, but it might help inspire somebody to figure out what their thing is, whatever that may be. And then also being kind of useful and helpful to the community, which is kind of what I'm trying to do here with the Patreon, is to help people through the struggles, because like we've talked about, like it's difficult. It's a challenging craft. Even just like basic, what sometimes seem like basic techniques and skills can still be challenging from time to time. And I make mistakes all the time. And I think honestly, the reason I've gotten to where I am with what I do with my Damascus making, handle sculpting, and everything like that, is through making mistakes. Um, and but I think the value in the creativity is to help inspire others and to bring value to others in that way, and for others to connect, to feel a connection with each other. Um, that helps just really overall just enrich our lives and these existences that we have for such a short period of time. You might as well make them beautiful and enjoyable and interesting, you know.
Exactly. Reset thing. But in sharing energy with things have perfection, you need to feel good within yourself. Money doesn't quite do that. I mean, having done without money for so long when I was younger,
Sure. Right.
having to live the way I lived and do, you, I got more enjoyment out of sharing artwork. I got more enjoyment out of
Mm,
seeing other people respond to what you've created. And that drove me to do things new and different. And
yeah.
that's where the real enjoyment is how do
Right.
people respond? And in most instances, it's quite positive, the response to whatever you create. No matter what you've painted, it doesn't matter what you've done. In most instances, it'll be positive responses. And there's always some negatives too, but you have to take both and weigh the differences.
Right.
And they both make you feel either way. You know, for me, the financial side has never been a thought. I look at things so
Mm,
differently, of surviving. You know, if I have enough, and it's a weird way to think, but you know, if there's enough here to buy food, I plan things out way in advance. So I have
okay.
to. It's just the way I've always done it.
Yeah.
It's you build your life out for the next 6 months in your mind of what you have to do and how you're going to survive.
Hmm.
And as long as you cover early on what you're going to be doing, then everything else is okay. And the stress doesn't kick in.
Yeah.
and, and you can share the creative energy with other people and feel good about what you're getting, because I don't know, making things out of solid gold and things like that, you get into a large cost in creating those pieces, and that can be
Sure.
painful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And gold, the value of gold is just going up and up
absolutely.
as things
Yeah.
in our economy get crazier and crazier.
Yeah,
Uh,
I had a customer wanting to have a piece similar to that solid gold sword I did, that Delane and I did in '90 or in the early 2000s, and that one had, that was the one with
is it this
four
piece?
point, yeah, that's 4.14 pounds of 14 karat yellow and 18 karat and 22 karat gold,
Right.
3.8 pounds of sterling silver. And when I said pounds, I mean literal Troy pounds. So,
Holy shit.
yeah,
Oh my god.
yeah, there's 900
Woo.
diamonds and 80 carats of rubies. The
That's
whole piece was
amazing.
27.5 inches long.
Oh,
And
wow. So that is a legitimate sword.
yeah, it's a short sword. Yeah, it's a
Holy
massive
shit.
piece. And it's
Yeah.
all solid silver and gold. The only thing that is steel in it is there's a piece that holds the tang in. There's a tang that's stainless steel. Other than that,
Mm,
it's all solid gold.
right.
And but yeah, you get people
What
who
a
want
piece.
something like that, and the problem you have is, when you're looking at 4.5 pounds of gold, basically, at today's market, you start adding that up, that gets real expensive real quick, and you
Yes.
can't afford to make it. I don't think I could, anybody, I mean, I'm sure there are people who can afford it, but
Mhm.
just to build that material cost alone puts it out of the market share. There's no possible way. You can't even
Right.
price it to people because it becomes so crazy when you price it, uh,
Mm,
because it's just the way it works. But
yeah.
anyway, uh, pricing structure on something like that, and then you look at it in the end, and people think, "Wow, it's like, no, I mean, you barely eat. People
Right.
think that because you make these elaborate pieces that you're just rolling in the cash, and it's like, no, you make a piece and it costs you 89 to 90% of what you've got in it, or
Yeah.
charge for it to make it, because you have to add in all your time, material cost, and I mean, you have electric and sandpaper. I mean, everything.
Yeah.
It's all in there, not just all the gold. And then you just basically toss the gold and diamonds and rubies and sapphires on top of all that.
Right.
So, yeah, I wish it was like that. I wish it was making things from nothing. I wish it was like that. But you have to
Mhm.
have all those material costs.
Yeah. I wanna get into we've done a ton of conversation around design, and I'm sure there's still gonna be more. But I would be curious to talk about, kind of your experience in regard to the different, like the knife making guild and different organizations like that, and the ABS knife making guild, what things were like when you because I think the one of the things we struggle with right now in knife making in general and the craft is understanding where things were and how they've changed, um so that we can continue to hopefully progress in a positive direction. But it's difficult to find those stories or to, find the archives and kind of but, or not archives, but just I'm also interested to hear, especially when I talk with makers like yourself who've been in the knife making scene and doing this craft for such a long period of time and have seen kind of a progression and evolution. I mean, like you said, you've made your first knife in '74, and then you kinda got back into it and more serious about it in '79, I believe you said.
Correct.
Um, and then and so I'm curious where
I was
I
still in the
guess
high. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, no, I was just gonna say what it was like for you when you first started, and what values and virtues you see in the various organizations, and maybe even touching on the various shows. You talked about Blade Show and the Nashville show, but also, the I think you were part of like oh gosh, what is it, the art knife shows as well for a time, and I'm curious to get kind of your take and your perspective on um that part of the knife making, experience and craft and just, like and shows in general. I don't
Okay.
that was not a very well worded question, but all of those things.
I'll try to piece it together. We'll see where we
Okay,
go. Starting out with the back on the design thought process,
sure.
and it's a complete thought. So I can actually read something I have written about this. Right, like it says, I
Mm,
see the completed piece in my mind in 3 dimensions. It
okay.
evolves from there. Everything has to be thought out and then created in layers and perspective. There is a depth that has to be taken into consideration. Then each piece has to be created like a painting, background first, but mentally built from the outside in.
Mm,
So you look at everything in 3 dimensions. And it is like that. That's what you do inside. And then the thought and innovation in creating the other elements from there. So everything works together as a whole. There also has to be a focal point. But in an object that is 3D, your center focal point changes as the piece moves in your hands. So it has to have visual interest from all angles, not just top or bottom, but every visible angle. By doing this, you create an exploration of the work that allows others to explore with their eyes and their mind. Rather than try to figure out what I may be trying to say in the piece, they create their own story from their own images that they have in their own thoughts. And it works quite well. People always state art is in the eye of the beholder. So instead of forcing an idea or a personal thought on people, I like to let them create their own story. Hence, the viewer is the beholder and also the creator of the story or thought that unfolds in their mind. I just create the spark or the conduit to allow all this to happen. And that's actually what you do with everything you create. You're creating a story from your own personal emotions and your own feelings, and you're sparking lighting a spark in other people's minds to relate to what you do. So you become the conduit in action. It's what the artist actually is. It's a conduit between your physical body of emotion that you're sharing to people, and you're the conduit. So as you connect that or show it to someone, the patron itself can see that, and they have their own personal experience. You know, there's no reason to sit there and explain to somebody why you did something. It should never have to be done that way. If things are done correctly, it already shares that with people when they see it.
Yeah.
It already has it all. The story's already there. You've already shared everything. There's nothing to me worse to do than to sit around and explain to somebody why something looks like it looks. Because if you have to do that, it's not correct. It needs to be fixed. Because it should say what it says to people on its own. It shouldn't need your voice there with it. And it's a complicated thing to get through until you finally do. You feel your own success when you do it. You'll feel it when you see your own work in the mirror. You just will. You'll see things that work. You won't know why. Most people don't. But lines and shapes like that work harmoniously together, and they work in people's minds, and most people aren't even aware why they like something so much. They don't even know. And it has to do with the harmony. Everything and that vibrational emotion that you've put in that works, and they click it, they seal it, they see it, they feel it, and they become attracted to it because they can work with it. It's just when we're getting into art, we get into these subjects that people think, oh God, we're going into that. But actually, it's the way it works in all forms of art and creative energy. Everything you create is done that way. And, you know, everyone who sees it, every patron, every person, even you in the mirror, you're seeing the vibrational energy in harmony, and you feel it within. And it all works, you know, like I said earlier, with the limbic system in your mind. The emotional side of your brain is where art is felt. And that works through your eyes and how you translate that vibrational energy into a feeling inside your brain. And that's where everyone sees things differently, because everyone sees stuff just a little bit different point of view. But it's complicated, but it's not. It's complicated to explain. That's the way to put it. You know, I have a hard time explaining it in simplified terms.
I don't know. I feel like the explanations you've been sharing make perfect sense to me, honestly. And they're probably the best explanations I've ever heard regarding art and craft. The differences and the relationship or the similarities between the two.
Yeah, it's hard to keep the art. It's hard to keep the art and the craft and the function all in one thing, and that's a complicated process. It's really like being controlling a symphony. You really are doing that because you have to abide by certain perimeters. This has to be fully functional this way. It has to do this. It has to feel good. It has to look good, and that's kind of where art in knives kind of becomes fun, you know. And there's certain things I push things as far as I can push them and still remain a knife. I don't get too far out there. it'd be real easy to do. But then you get into pure
Sure.
sculpture work, and there's no
Right.
sense in doing that, and just and trying to share it in the knife world. I mean, if I'm going to do that, I'll make watches or lamps and stuff like that. But it's
Sure.
just that's the way that stuff works.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, it's like with the time machine knives that I did before. Those knives actually were functional. They looked like they were held together with little pieces of brass and copper, and they weren't. They were actually all welded together internally.
Hmm.
The folding knives and the big daggers and things
Yeah.
were all the suspension blades, all the blades that look like they're held by a little tiny piece of brass has actually got a hardened steel pin underneath that brass. It's all welded to a steel frame understructure. It's
Hmm.
fully functional. No, you couldn't drive it in the side of a tree and use it as a tree stand peg or anything like that. But it still was a functional knife. And yeah, like that one.
Hmm.
And that's all welded together, even though it doesn't look it. Everything else is just icing on the cake. You
Sure.
have to make it pretty from the outside and make it visually appealing. But inside, the structure and the bones still have to work. So that's the roots of the foundation. Um, it's a unique thing. Try to hide all of that, but yet still keep it pleasing to the eye.
Right. Yeah.
The whole Time Machine series was like that. It was just something new and different that people hadn't seen before in knives.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember the first time I saw them, I was like, "What the fuck is going on
Yeah,
here?"
exactly. Yeah,
And the
there's a
more
lot of
I
people who
looked at
like
it,
it,
the
and a
more
lot of
I
people.
loved it. I was like, "Oh my god, Lynn, how like just the way things were connected and even just like especially like on let's see, I think it's this piece.
Either you
Yeah,
like them or
and
you
how
didn't. It's the way it worked.
yeah, and
Uh,
just like the choice of the way things popped out of like the surf in the handle scale, like where the tubes pop out and go back in, and the flow of the lines, like in the what would be the ricasso area
right.
of the blade. Yeah, I
The
love it.
funny thing about this whole series is, and this is the God's honest truth, I had never heard of steampunk when I made the first one.
Okay,
I had never heard of steampunk at all.
right,
And I had people saying, "Well, that's steampunk," and I'm like, I had no clue what that was. And it was fascinating to start seeing. That's one of the reasons I only did a limited number of those, because I like to do things for a short period of time and I push them as far as I can, and then you have to stop
sure.
because you don't want to make the same thing over and over and over the rest of your life. It's just it it stops working.
Mhm,
If there's a way to say that, it stops helping you. And
mm.
you have to do.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. You're breaking up a little bit. I wanna make sure we get this because I think it's gonna be good. Alright, I think you're back. Oh, wait, it went red. Damn it. It's alright. It's nobody's fault. It's just the what it is. We're gonna write it. Um, but I just wanna make sure that your audio is back when you come back and share these thoughts because I think there's a lot of value in what you're saying.
Right now, I almost
Yeah.
can't even.
While we're waiting for it to come back up, I'm gonna pop through these various images. Actually, this first one, oh, I think it might actually just come back up. This is the one we actually use for the Artisans steel calendar. Um, and Van can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure this is the one we use. It is absolutely. This is one of the pieces that really stood out to me. That I really love. That was so unique. I believe it's a folder, but it might be a fixed blade.
No, that's
Um,
a folder.
it is a folder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's got all these like these kind of industrial looking rivets like you can imagine seeing on giant machinery and structures or even in steel structures, but in all the different cogs and these tubes and wires rolling around and the
Especially if you
gold.
look at it from the point of view of the Industrial Revolution and the time frame,
Sure.
you're looking at the 1890s to. That's kind of where
Mhm.
that whole thought process came from, and it's still
Yeah,
fascinating to me that I was thinking about that and had never heard of steampunk, and now I should.
sure.
Uh, it's
No, it's
fascinating.
great. Well, and it honestly, it kind of reminds me. of things I've seen, like documentaries about Tesla and in kind of his uh perspective on things. And I don't know why, it just like it makes me think of Tesla in a way.
Exactly.
Um is that kind of something that you had in mind when you were
Yeah,
making some of these pieces?
basically in that thought process, yes. There's an entire thought between um, everything to me is also light. So,
Hmm.
you know, everything is light and shadow, and you know you have to tune those together, and then you get to the vibrational energy, and you know, light, shadow, and negative space. So you
Hmm.
have light and dark, good and evil, whatever you want to call it, and negative space, things that aren't there, but yet you use them to your advantage to create things and make the illusion of things
Right.
being there. So art itself. But within this stuff, there's a lot of negative space here, and it was used purposely the way it is with pipes in the middle of it. And what happens is it creates a full visual, but yet there's nothing there. If you start looking at this piece for what it actually is, it's minimal parts. There's a huge amount of work in it. Yet there is a lot of pieces because you're looking at, I think those pieces had 700 separate pieces as
Wow.
far as rivets
Oh,
and
so
screws and all the different things like that.
sure.
And you put them all together, and it all flows into one continuous piece with the flow. I'm looking at the one you're looking at now. That was a very unique. There were two of those pieces,
Hmm.
and those had the standoff handle pieces. I
Yeah,
did raised handle scales on those, and I had never like that before, and I thought it was a cool way because it was quite functional. It's very comfortable. If you ever get a
I
chance
believe
to
it.
do something like that, do it because it gives you a cool look from all different angles. When you get something like that, when your handle scales stand in almost an eighth inch off, those are not quite an eighth inch, although they look like it.
Okay.
It creates a full grip. The whole point of having them at the height you want, you just adjust
Mm,
how you want it to feel in your hand. You have to
right.
think about it. And then you carve the outside pieces of the handle material into the curves that fit those areas of your hand.
Hmm.
And then you piece it all together. That has actually threaded inserts in the back of all the pieces of um, material, handle material, and
Oh,
they
okay.
thread through onto the inside. So
Excuse me.
they're screwed into the liner from
Yeah.
the inside, and it's all countersunk on the inside. And then the pieces hold it all together.
So
It's
cool.
kind of, yeah, it pretty was cool. I mean, it is pretty cool.
Yeah, anybody who's listening to this, if you jump into the podcast at about the 1 hour and 40 minute mark, this is on YouTube. This is where you can see all the different images that we're discussing right here. I want to go back to what you were saying before we kind of started losing the audio a little bit, and the point you were starting to make about. Oh my God, my brain just died.
Yeah.
And I didn't
Yeah.
want to lose it. Now I can't think. I can't. If anybody in the chat can remember where we were at, but we were talking about.
Well, I'm bouncing in and out too. I have no clue why the internet connection is so bad here today.
It's because we're trying to do a recording. We're trying to do something really nice,
Yeah, it's really
and
cool. You want
it's
to
like,
say a
"Oh,
lot
you
of
want
things?
to do that? No,
Yeah,
sorry, not today. We're gonna fuck with you the whole time."
you want to say a lot of them do. And I've notes in these correct on all kinds of way at work.
Hmm.
Uh, well, there were so many things that you've asked. So ask another question, and we'll start from there.
Okay. Um. God, I feel like we were talking about kind of exploring,
That's the bad
a
thing. It's the bad thing
yeah.
about in and out with my internet. It's terrible that that's happening.
No, I think we were talking about how you were dedicating time to these timepieces, but you can't do them forever ever. But I think it's really intriguing and interesting that you allowed yourself a good amount of time. It looks like, I mean, based on the work, just the few pieces that we have pictures of. You said there were 15 in total, to kind of really explore that concept through various forms, through folders, through fixed blades, through daggers, as well as a watch is part of the time machine. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, and
watches and boxes and all the different
yeah, and all the
aspects
different,
of the thing.
yeah,
I
the way the knives are
actually,
being held and mounted. Yeah,
right.
so cool.
I I even did a lamp. That one that you just had up, that was actually a paperweight desktop letter opener,
Okay.
and you crank the crank and all the gears move and the well pump goes up and down and everything like that works. It's a pretty cool piece.
So cool. Oh,
Yeah,
the
it's
crank
got a
right here next to the blade,
yeah.
right?
There's a crank. No, there's a crank on the other
Oh,
side.
it's on the other side. Here, let's see.
Yeah, I may not have sent that. Yeah, there it is. See it?
There it is. Yep. I see the crank handle.
And you crank that, and all the gears turn in motion, and the pump goes up and down like an oil well rig. It's pretty cool. That's all ebony and bronze.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But all the things always moved and did things. That was the whole point about him. There was a
Sure.
satisfaction of being able to create those types of pieces and
All those ones.
explore it, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And you can explore a lot of it, and you push it as far as you can push it. I
Sure.
mean, and then to go any farther would have made it not a knife anymore. And
Mm,
so, you go as far as you can go with what you do. On the art side of it, because those were never meant to be a fully functional piece. You've got knives with gears and glass. I mean, you're
right.
not going to be able to use that on the roof cutting shingles. And I mean, it's just not. It's not going to happen that way. And it wasn't meant to be that way.
Right.
I get a hard time from people about those things, and it was never meant to be that. It was meant to be what it is, and it's hard to explain that. But it is a style. It is a genre. It's an art
Mhm.
knife, and it's meant to be what it is.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. I don't go around criticizing somebody's hunting knife because that's not a fishing knife. No, but it's true. I mean,
Sure.
you don't do it from the other point of view. Why should people do it to you if you're in the art world?
Right.
Especially when you've been in the hunting knife world for what, my God, 21 years before I started doing full-time art knives.
Right.
I
God. Wow.
Yeah, long time. So I made hunting knives completely for 16 years. I still did art knives in between all that, but then I shifted over into making mostly folding knives and daggers in 95.
Okay.
And then from 95 till now, it's been mostly just very unique, one-of-a-kind, one-off things. It's been the most enjoyable part, even though it's been the hardest because there's been lots of ups and downs.
Sure.
Dealing with my thought process and the way my brain works. Sometimes that wonderful filing cabinet you have stored in your mind that allows you to do everything has a tendency to get dumped out on the floor ever so often,
Oh, shit.
once in a while.
Sure.
Yeah, when that happens, you've dumped out 30 or 40 filing cabinets that are 25 to 30 feet long, and all that information is everywhere. And
Mhm.
it takes you a little while to resort and
Yeah.
refile everything, and there's a lot of people who are creative that go through those processes, and
Yeah.
it happens to everybody. And well, not everybody, but it does. If you use that side of your creative energy process, it can happen to you. It's real easy to slip off into some strange places.
Mhm.
That's why it's so good to function and create, because
Yeah.
again, it's create or die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were doing the hunting knives, did you, or I guess when it comes to organizations, what organizations have you been a part of? When did you join them, and kind of how have they changed over the years? Um, I'd be curious to get your perspective on, because I feel like you mentioned the Knife Makers Guild before. Um, and I might be getting that wrong, but I guess, yeah. So what are some organizations that you've been part of or associated with, and how have they changed, and where's the value? I think, where do you see the value in some of these organizations and guilds that are still around today, of course?
I didn't get involved in any organizations until the very late 90s. And
Okay.
then I got involved with the ABS and Knife Makers Guild.
Okay.
And I became an AKI member in
Right.
92, I think. I mean, 2002, I think, or 2003.
Okay.
I can't remember. I was in the AKI for 10 years.
Okay.
And the the guild and the ABS and things, they're great. I I wasn't early on going to a lot of shows, so
Sure.
I wasn't around a lot of people, and I didn't join any of the guilds and things early on. I think they're great for people who need that camaraderie and that type of togetherness, so to speak. You
Sure.
have a large,
Like the kind of community that comes
yeah,
with
you have
some
a
of those.
community
Yeah.
of people that you can question and ask things about.
Sure.
And there's huge advantage to that because it allows you to get past certain obstacles that you may have set for yourself and not even known it in your own mind and your own work.
Hmm.
And that does help when you need help in certain areas. Creatively, it seems to work for a lot of people, but I think personally, sometimes people tend to think using their creative energy is different than what it actually is because sometimes they look at something and think, well, if I put stones and things on mine, that it'll look just like that, and
Mm.
that's a little bit different. But no, the group situation works out well. I mean, the hammer ins and things like that. We've taught
Sure.
at one or two different hammer ins before,
Oh, cool.
and taught design, actually shape and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun. And I think that's a great thing for people to be involved in. I am no longer involved in any of those, but it's just
Sure.
not doing many shows these days and spending so much time building what I'm building. And then, of
Hmm.
course, the last couple of years, everything changed for everybody for a period of while or period of time,
Yeah.
and the whole market seems to have changed and shifted
Sure.
all the way around. And that I hear good things and bad things. I don't know how that works for people on those sides.
Right.
But I do think that the organizations are good if you like that type of togetherness, with a
Yeah.
lot of people and give, asking everybody things, but worry about someone
Mm.
with a lot of people, ideas and thought processes, colors and things. Early on it was full color niter bluing on knives, and nobody.
Hmm.
There've been, I think, it seems like Jerry Fisk and Anatoly did one piece with
Is this an
niter
example of some of that?
bluing on it. Yeah, that was one of the pieces. The other ones were the
Okay.
card ones. I only did a few with niter bluing, but it was
Okay.
so popular. I won Best of Show and Best Art Knife at Blade Show that year. The first year I
Oh,
did those, I
nice.
think it was '98, and I had phone calls from all around the world of people wanting to know how to do that, and it has to do
Sure.
with alloy content and actually heat and temp control. The
Okay.
problem with that, it's so you have to use annealing or not annealing, so you don't pull this out. But it's a process. Now they've temp niter bluing. I still don't blue that way. I blue with oxenate 7. I've
Okay.
managed to learn how to use oxenate 7 with multiple alloys, and I can achieve reds,
Sure.
greens, blues,
Oh,
and
wow.
pinks, and
You
all
you
that.
broke up just for a second. So you're saying with the original process, when you first were doing it, you had to be careful with the temperatures you were working at?
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
because niter bluing salts are 600 degrees,
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
yeah, that's a you can draw with a tiny bit of hardness with that hot of a process.
Sure.
But on a dagger blade, if you're going from 62 to 58, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But
No. Right.
so make sure things are. But different alloys color at different rates, so you have to learn how to do that. It's a process to keep it clean. Just niter bluing and oxidizing part of that mean you're going to have coloring, modeled looks,
Sure.
and learning how to separate things in those days with nickel and different types and different alloys through the different types of carbon, high carbon,
Right.
low carbon mixtures, whatever it is you're using, doing. Everything turns a different color at a different rate. And
Yeah.
same temperature, but just different timing. However long it's in the salts define on what color it will be when you take it out. And
Interesting.
also, and also the thickness of the material. So if your piece is
Oh,
totally
wow.
finished out and you have a hollow ground blade, the edge of the blade will turn obviously faster in the center.
Right, because the heat's transferring in the thinner
Right.
cross section quicker.
So you have to devise a way to preheat the blade, which I would have to do. So I would preheat the blade on a
Hmm.
in an oven actually, and then pull it
Sure.
out of the oven and go into the niter salts with it already hot.
Yeah.
And by doing that, it allowed it to change pretty close to the same, and you didn't get the effect.
I got
It's
you.
a prefer using Oxenate 7. I've done a lot of bluing over the years. I started bluing knives in the 80s, and there weren't
Oh
many
wow.
people doing it, and still not really. I mean, I blued
Sure.
all the guards and things like that were always black on them with gold and
Yeah,
pieces like that.
especially on that previous dagger, like and it's such a high polish.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
it's all
kind of
mirror
shocking.
finished. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
fucking crazy.
the Oxenate 7 is pretty cool. If you see it in person, it's even cooler. The shine is so deep,
Yeah.
works out quite well. The one on the left in there that you're showing now with the
Yeah.
gold, that
Right.
was gold. Actually, that gold mask, and the nickel's been played gold,
Okay.
and the rest of it was done in black, and it's been done with baking lacquer actually. So it was deep, spray painted with baking lacquer, baked in the oven to hard lacquer, and then the
Sure.
surface was all sanded off, and then you golded all the highlight nickel. That was the only one I did that way. I did a dagger and that at the same time
Okay.
frame, and then didn't play with it anymore after that. I don't know. I just got into those areas of learning how to do something and playing with it, or coming up with an idea and trying it, and
Sure.
then quitting. I stopped doing the niter bluing because the niter bluing surface texture is sort of like what happens with oxidizing titanium. It can wear off over a period of time,
Mm,
and
I got
I
you.
didn't like that. It's too thin. Unlike the oxenate, which is a deep black hot gun bluing
Okay.
meant to go on gun barrels, it doesn't wear off near as easy as a high temperature thin layer content or the
I
surface
got
plate
you.
treatment does.
I
Um,
pulled up another. This is a folding dagger that
yeah,
looks like it's got the oxidate again.
yeah, that actually has oxygenated bluing on the blade. That's pink, I mean yellow and red in that. That's a gold and red collar. I
Yeah.
wish it was zoomed in on that photograph, but it's not. Um, and that also has steel granulation. And I've done granulation on knives on a few pieces, and then gold granulation, and then started doing steel granulation. So those are each individually little tiny round balls all welded to that under a
Oh, holy
microscope.
smokes.
Yeah, each one welded individually under a microscope.
And you can so as a reference for people, if they want to see these pictures in a larger format or in higher resolution, they can go to your website to see
Mm-hmm.
those. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, at vanbarnettart.com.
Van
And
Barnett.
or go to knives delanaknives.com. Her
Okay.
website's actually nicer than mine. She did a new one. I'm still in the process of finishing my new
Sure,
website.
sure.
Takes a lot of time. The
It does.
granulation process is pretty neat though. You weld, I've not seen anybody do that in knives before. I think I saw someone do it in jewelry.
Okay.
But all the little balls are 1 millimeter, and
Oh wow.
and then there's 1.2 millimeter on the ends, which give you a little tiny bit bigger, and they're all welded to the surface under a microscope, one at a time, and then it's all hot blued black. And
Holy
then everything
smoke.
else is gold that sets in between it. These are all multi-layered pieces, and it's done
Yeah.
multi-layered to show depth, dimension, and negative space.
Right.
This knife shows you all of that. So you see the negative space. There's stuff there, but not. There's holes completely through it. You can see all the way through it.
Sure.
There's texture, depth, shadow, and it's all there in one piece. And it works okay. You know, it's a different piece. I was just looking for something unique and new, a little bit
Sure.
different.
Well, and if somebody's watching this, I just pulled it up full screen. If you're watching it on your laptop and you go full screen, you can see so the iron or the metal balls that he's talking about, he's got like what's the inlay over the handle, the main portion of the
The
handle?
gold and the T shell.
Right, the
Shell
shell.
handle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so they kind of border the gold and kind of emphasize it. Almost looks like I've seen it in jewelry, like in rings. Is it called? It's not called. Is it called bezeling?
Yeah, the bezel
Okay.
set rubies
Yeah.
and the bezel set stones in the hand, there's rubies there. And
Mhm.
the granulation was the hard part on that. It took a long time
Sure.
on that, and everything had to be welded. Then I had to do 3
Yeah,
different handle plates for it because I kept dropping one and breaking balls off because it was not set yet.
oh, fuck.
And yeah, you just lay things out. It's like I remember talking with Buster Weritsky when he did the Tut Dagger, and he had a handle piece
Mm,
all set out with gold granulation, and there were like hundreds and hundreds of little gold balls
mhm.
all stuck on with a resin, waiting to be fused into place in the oven. And
Oh my
it
god.
it got knocked off onto the floor, and like 1,000 gold balls went everywhere, all over the shop.
Oh
And
my god.
yeah, it's taken days to put that on, and he didn't have a
Yeah.
microscope at that time either.
Holy
But
smokes.
yeah, it's
Can you talk about th- the AKI and kind of explain that a bit? I did one show uh that Steve Delac put on called the Arts and Metal Show. And it's like an art knife show, a collector show, like a high-end collector show. At least that's like how it was kind of presented to me, and talking to other makers, that's kind of how they framed it. But if you could help kind of paint a more clearer picture of what these shows are like. You did them for 10 years, it sounds like.
we did
And
the
what Oh,
we
go
were
ahead.
both in, oh no, we were both in the AKI for
Okay.
Delana was in longer than me. She got in before I
Okay.
did, actually. Back when we were doing it in the AKI, it was a small group of all these different types of people like that. Michael
Mhm.
Walker and Ron Lake and all these people were involved in the show at that time.
Yeah.
And it just it started for me. It got more difficult to complete the pieces I was doing in the last year I did the show. So I ended up having to
Okay.
stop doing the show because I wasn't able to get all of my pieces finished. I mean, when you're doing something that takes you 6 months to do one thing and you got another thing to do and you plan on three
Right.
pieces and you can't get all three done, that doesn't look good for the show. So it's better just not to do it that way.
Sure, and they have kind of stipulations about, how many pieces you have at the show, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you have to do, already described everything you have, and you have one extra piece and all of a sudden you can't get that piece done. Then it
Right.
really hurts you
Oh, right,
overall.
because they put together a catalog.
Yep. Yep. You
I
have a
forgot.
catalog, and customers come and they expect to be able to bid on those types of pieces, and all of a sudden you don't have it there. It's fair to the collectors. So
Mhm.
I understand the situation. Do that.
Sure.
But that was when Phil Lobred was he started the Art Knife Invitational in the '80s, and it
Okay.
ran for a few years, and then it didn't for a long period of time, and then it restarted in the late '90s again,
Okay.
and it had a whole new popularity, and things really took off in the early 2000s with a different collector market coming into the Art Knife Invitational, and really enjoyed. I'm not familiar with what all goes on because I've not been to any of shows and
Sure.
not talked to people too much about what happens. But I'm sure it's pretty much based on the same process of the drawing of knives,
Yeah.
and you put your name in the box and you draw the names, and people have a certain amount of knives for sale at the show, and
Yeah.
the catalogs work the same way. It's been done that way for a long time.
Is that something, being 'cause, from what I feel like I've heard or discussed with other knife makers about the AKI, the people that, there's a limited number of makers that do the AKI, and and then they're voted in by existing members that or makers that attend the show. At least I think that's how that works. I guess, um, what is
That's how it used to be. I don't
that's
know
how it
if
used
it's
to be.
that way
Okay.
now anymore. I don't
Okay.
know. That's the one thing I don't know about the newer show. I don't know if it's
Okay.
that way. It used to be that you had to
Oh,
be,
that's right, because it's a new ownership,
yeah,
and
exactly.
it's moved from California, right, to Las Vegas?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how the new one runs. It
Okay.
may be the same way, but it used to be 25 makers,
Yeah,
and the 25 makers actually voted on the new membership for the show that way.
sure. Was that something becoming part of that Art Knife Invitational, is that something that, um, you were driven to try to accomplish, like that was a goal that maybe you had set for yourself? What was kind of the some of the driving force, I guess, for wanting for becoming part of that, and then kind of like maintaining that and doing that for a few years? And what were some of the benefits, I guess, of doing that show, and maybe some of the drawbacks, if you don't mind sharing?
The benefits, really, there weren't any drawbacks as far as I know.
Oh,
With
good.
there's not really any. It's a positive experience, and any maker you've ever heard of in the world at one time, well, not any, but the big names you've ever heard of were all members. Usually, that's the way it was in the early
Sure.
days of the AKI.
Okay.
And so uh, it's it was a goal, I guess you could say, but it happened. My biggest goal when I was younger is always, for some reason, in the 80s, I can remember always wanting to build something and go to the Knife Makers Guild and win the WW Kronk Award. Because for some reason, that was the biggest honor you could win at the time throughout the
Okay.
80s and 90s was the guild show, best of show at the guild show. And
Okay.
I always wanted to do that. And I strived in my mind and always told myself, someday I'm going to be this and someday I'm going to be that. And I wasn't doing any type of show like that. I was doing the Blade show
Hmm.
every so many years in the 80s. And then I started doing it on a regular basis every year in about 90, 89, 90.
Okay.
And, those were the goals of always building things that were totally new. To me, being innovative and creative was the most important process. And that's what drove me on to make what I made,
Sure.
to make pretty much anything. Being creative. It really wasn't a desire to be a member of a group or something, with the exception of, for some reason, wanting to win that award. That is what pushed me when I was younger, for some
I guess.
strange reason. It was just
Yeah.
it's an art knife thing. It was the one thing about it. It's what it was about, was that award. And being a member in the AKI was a wonderful honor. Being voted into that group of makers, of prestigious people that was involved in that, and that opens you up to a a, a unique market share that you're in that group, um, uh, and it's like you're recognized as a proof, so to speak.
Sure.
Some in essence, at least already already selling and doing things, but for some reason, it's like a seal of approval, I guess, from the knife
Right.
industry itself. I don't know how that works.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And but as far as downsides, there wasn't any. It's with the exception of the hard. In later years, it got very difficult to get
Excuse me.
everything done, especially the last couple of years. It made it really, really hard because I was doing things like the time machine pieces,
Right.
and you're spending months and months and months building a piece that has 800 or 900 separate pieces involved, and you have to hand make all those pieces, with the
Yeah.
exception of the watch gears. I didn't make my own watch gears,
Okay.
but I had to scavenge those.
Hmm.
And all the tiny parts and pieces and everything. That was the years of the time machine pieces and the first years of those. And that's when I should have stuck with things I was already doing. But I always thought the show was in the original thing. The show was supposed to be things that took you 2 years to build.
Oh, wow. Oh,
That was the
because
point of it.
it was every other year, right? It's
Yeah. And
not an annual thing.
right. It was every other year. And you had the 2 years to come up with something new and unique. And most people
Right.
did that early on. And then it started getting harder for me. And then I got into doing some really elaborate things. And you get this thing of, you got three massive ideas and you want to do all three, and you find out that you can only do two. There's no possible way to do all three.
Mm,
But you don't find that out until after you've said you're going to do all three.
right.
So
I can imagine that's really challenging too, when you're building you're exploring new processes potentially, and building new things that are innovative, and you're really pushing yourself as a maker, but probably the whole time there isn't necessarily a consistent income coming in. So it's like you're dedicating months, like you're saying, months and months of time into building these things that sell at an event that happens once every couple of years, that sounds like that could be really challenging for kind of
It's
like that fluctuation of income just in a way.
it's it's very challenging. That's the
Yeah.
whole point of that. Is what I've said before. Was that
Yeah.
it's like strategic living. You have
Sure.
to plan out how you survive. I
Mhm.
mean, you know what you're going to have here and there, hopefully, and you plan out for that, and you have to you know you do without a lot of things, or you end up saving back things, and you have to sell things off in between times,
Mm.
and you have to make other things that you've either made in the past or you still have, and you have
Yeah.
to sell those things in the middle of a process to cover expenses on certain things of
Right.
living, just living itself. It's kind of I mean, I've never had children or anything like that, so it's made
Yeah.
it a little different for me. If I'd have had children and a wife early on and all that, I didn't get married until I was 29, the first, yeah,
Okay.
29, 30, almost 30. And I don't know if I could have survived if I'd have had to support a family at that time.
Sure.
You know, the clientele just wasn't there for that much to do it full time unless you were really well established already, or one of the few. There were a few guys who could make decent uh, money from knife making, but not many were doing it full time, and they still aren't. There's just not a lot of people who do that full time as their only source of income,
Yeah.
and it's not something that's easy to do because you have a lot of hardship in there. Whether people would know it or not, there's a lot of times you do without a lot of things, and people don't quite understand that because a lot of people making knives have a wife with a good source of income or some other type
Sure.
of passive income or another job.
Right.
Look at, I've never had health insurance,
Sure.
you know, never
Wow.
had that. And
Yeah.
and that's not saying poor me. It's just I've never been able
Right.
to afford it. You can't.
Yeah.
And people look at the things you make. I make what I make because it makes me feel satisfied inside. I feel
Sure.
good doing what I do. I don't do it for fame. I don't do it for fortune. Jesus, no. And
Sure.
it's if it's something that makes me feel good. I'm sharing my creative energy and I get to do it in ways that are new and different each time. I wouldn't want to be building things over like I did in the early 80s. I was making 20 a week. They were about 4 different patterns, and you're making lives line process. And
Right.
that gets old real quick, and it becomes not fun. It becomes not fun at all.
Sure.
And it can be depressing, and
Yeah.
you have to be creative. That's why I was, even in those early days, I would still do an art project in between. I would still do an art knife at the same time doing these. So you get a break on something. You work on this in the evenings, afternoons, or in weekends, and you
Yeah.
build these other pieces to take your mind off of the monotony that day out doing the exact same thing over and over and over with just different handle materials.
Sure.
I guess that's the
Yeah.
hard part for a lot of streets. You're in a competitive market area like that was. You're making hunting knives. I was lucky and I had a contract with an outfitter out west, and I was making
I see.
a bunch of knives and also selling to other places too. And that worked out okay. I mean, it allowed me to eat, but realistically, at $20 a piece, you're not making much by the time you pay for the materials and steel and everything else.
Yeah. No.
You know,
Wow.
that's what they were being sold for.
Oh, right. So
Yeah.
your actual take was even like
Oh
a
yeah. I was.
30% less than
Yeah.
that, at
Exactly.
least.
So I was
Yeah.
making $7 to $8 per knife. Not really profit either. That was my labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Holy smokies.
yeah. So the
Hustle for
really
real.
Yep. That's why you had to make 25, because you make
Right.
25 to manage to make maybe $100 off of 25 knives.
My
It's
goodness.
just works.
Um, I wanna step in another direction. You've touched base a little bit, and talked about, I always I hate so I have a very unusual name, and I hate messing up other people's names. And I wanna say Delana, but then inside my head, I'm like, "Wait, but is it Delana?"
Yeah,
And so,
it's Delana.
um, Delana.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Delana, when you hear this, because
Oh,
I've
she's
actually
fine.
met her and she's wonderful and she's incredible and she's so fucking talented. And and so that's even worse when you've actually met somebody and you still get their name wrong. Um, but you do you do a lot of work with Delana?
We
And
do.
and what's and kind of talk about like how you guys work with things and do things knife making wise and all that jazz.
Our
Because it must
collabor
be incredible to have that kind of like another creative person to kind of bounce things off of, and to have look at your work. Um, so yeah, please.
Yeah, it's a fascinating process. We've been together since '97, actually,
Okay.
and it's been a fun process. You both of us, we met at the Knife Makers Guild show in Las
Okay.
Vegas, actually, and then we were married later in '99 in Las Vegas on 9/9/90. That's all right,
Wow.
actually. Yeah,
Nice.
that was a fascinating day to get married. There were a line of people waiting to be married on 9/9/99.
99.99.
Yeah, they said there were about 10 times more people though on back in the past of 8888. That seemed to be the biggest
Oh
one.
wow. Sure.
Yeah, especially for the Japanese and Chinese people. There was a huge bunch of people there. But the same thing, there was a large amount of people getting married on 9/9/99.
Right.
Just because I guess it was a cool date. And my birthday is September the 10th. So it made it
Oh
easy
wow.
for me to remember. I'm not going
Sure.
to forget the anniversary.
That's good.
Working
That's a good move.
again environment has always been fun. She's
Yeah.
my never had friends due to my thought process. It makes it very difficult because I
Sure.
try, and I mean, you have friends and acquaintances that you talk with, but as far as close friends, I've never had any real
Sure.
close friends my whole life. I was a loner child. So, you play by yourself, and because you're a little bit different due to the way you think, people tend to not understand not like what they don't understand.
Right.
And it, it makes your life one of a loner. So her was fun because she's a lot like me. And so she became, my best friend. And we worked together quite well. And we started doing collaborations early on. Actually, we did a sword. I don't remember if I sent pictures of that one to you or
Oh,
not.
the gold sword?
It's one on black background. It's a really not very good
Mm,
photograph, but it's a D-guard sword with a carved eagle head on the pommel of it. We
okay.
did that for the Sultan of Brunei.
Oh, wow.
And I've done several pieces for them early in the late in mid to early '90s and late '90s until they stopped buying things in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And you build when you do things like this, you end up building things for royal people and queens, things like that's the way it is. And some people, you build things for that you're not ever allowed to show and you're
Sure.
not ever allowed to tell. And I have no idea why, but there are royal people who have bought things that you have, it's sort of like having a non-disclosure agreement,
I got you.
but it's a little different. And it's people who don't want things publicly known. If they buy something, you keep it quiet. And
Right.
so there is a lot of things out there I can't show people, and a lot of things I didn't have photographs of because I wasn't allowed to have them photographed. It's a strange thing, some of those pieces. But that
Get
one was that sword that we did the first collaboration with
Yeah.
Elena was for the Sultan of Brunei, and that allowed us to work together on a complete project from start to finish.
Okay.
And her being a goldsmith since the early '70s really made
Mm.
things really great because she's a goldsmith jeweler by trade.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you all of a sudden this new medium you get to work in, you got somebody who's a professional at at using gold and gemstones, and all of a
Right.
sudden you get to take what you've learned over all the years in this other side and then add something to it, and then it's a thing of sharing back and forth with things I did differently that she hadn't done, and you start learning these new techniques and processes, and it allowed
Sure.
us to collaborate on certain designs.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's pretty cool
That's
actually.
great.
And we collaborate on the design process of everything too. I'll usually lay out because of having the unfortunate ability to think about 100 billion things at 1 second. I'll lay out a basic design structure and she'll add to it.
Mm,
and it gives it its finished piece that way. Because I'll do an outline and a basic idea, and then sometimes she comes in, insert these parts and that actually dimension
I
visual.
see.
So
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine that being very challenging just to make decisions when you're thinking of so many things all at the same time.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very much
So
so.
it's good to have somebody there to bounce ideas off of or to help kind of facilitate choice making. Kinda.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you
That's
think
awesome.
about that many, when you think about that many things at once, it can be problematic, and it does get that way. I mean, building pieces is the thing. You build it instantly in your mind. You go through every step of the process, and it's not like you plan it out. And that's the hard part for me when I try to explain to people how I think about things like that. This isn't that I sit there and go through it at night in my mind and picture, doing this. This happens.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain that. It's like switch on, oh, the entire night. In the
Sure.
time you flip that on. By the time the electricity goes and transfers from the light switch to the light, that's how quick that thought process is.
That's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's pretty trippy. That's the thing about the the Asperger's that makes that way.
Yeah.
It's wonderful for certain things and it's terrible for other things. But
Mhm.
it's terrible for making friends because, like I said earlier, it makes it to where people ask you about things and they share their ideas on certain things, and you instantly can tell them that it won't work or it will work, and that makes you sound like you're the most arrogant asshole in the entire freaking world. It does, and people like
I
get that. I ain't gonna listen to that son of a bitch. He's the most arrogant son of a bitch, and it's not that at all. It's just the way I see things.
The same thing happens to me, just so you don't feel alone. The same thing happens to me when people talk about Damascus patterns. They'll be saying, "Oh, I wanna do this kinda layup, and then I wanna put it through this, that, and the other process," and, like, they're just kinda add it seems like they're kinda arbitrarily throwing out different processes, and in my head, I can see it every time they say, "I'm gonna do this process, and then I'm gonna do that, and I'm gonna cut it and restack it this many high." I'm watching this all happen as they're describing it, and they're like, "And I think it's gonna be really cool." I'm like, "I don't think that's gonna turn out the way you want it to." And then
Exactly.
I have to and they're like, "Well, why?" 'Cause I've just described all these really interesting processes. I'm like, more doesn't necessarily mean better." And so then I kind of, like, step it back and try to explain, and sometimes it works through and this usually happens with friends, where I can afford to kinda take that time to kinda explain that a little bit more. And, unfortunately, most of the time, they're like, "I see what you're saying now," or I understand, just like, I appreciate your input. Maybe I'll make a few simpler choices, or put it through fewer processes or whatever." But then at the same time, I definitely have people be like, "Well, I'm just gonna try it anyways."
Yeah,
And they spend days forging, making steel, grinding, all this stuff, and they're like, "You were right." I'm
that
like,
didn't
I
work.
don't know, some people, you just gotta figure it out on your own, experience the pain to be like, "Oh, alright."
Yeah, lucky you too that they still stayed liking you. In
Yeah.
my situation, it doesn't
Mm,
necessarily work that way. I don't know why.
sure.
It's like you know, it's wonderful to be able to think like that. It allows you to create, and it allows you to help and enunciate and say a lot of things to a lot of people that they can understand on a creative level.
Right.
And you can share enormous amounts of information because you're tapping into a place in your mind that it's hard to explain where those thoughts and things come from. I mean, you can ask any question you want of your own mind, and the answers come out of the
Sure.
blue.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
just appear in your mind. And lots of times when you start getting into the creative energy feeling, you vibrate at a higher rate and it makes you talk faster and you get more rapid in
Mm,
what you're saying and doing, and you speed up a little bit as you increase your vibrational speed. And it's all part of the creative process. You
right.
feel that it's almost like a buzz that happens to you, and it's a fun thing, but it's also a very strange thing.
Sure. I'm sure some of the people here in the Patreon have experienced me, especially when we do Q&As and I'm starting to explain things. I start out really slow and then my brain starts going. I'm trying to keep up with my brain as I'm talking, and I'll just start reeling and I feel like I'm talking 100 miles an hour. Um,
Exactly.
but
And
so,
you
oh
get
yeah.
to those points to where you're talking rapidly, and then sometimes the things can change over into some really cool things that you can say and come up with ideas and thought processes and all kinds of other things. And it's almost like you're learning them for the first time also.
Well, and it's good that I'm recording it because sometimes I'll get done recording a Q&A session, or when I'm doing the Knife Talk podcast, like we randomly get asked questions there and I'm answering them. And then literally when I'm done talking, I can't remember anything I just said. And I have to like go back and because I just like it's almost I joke that I like black out and I just start rattling off everything that's like stream of consciousness out of my mouth. And then I'm like, what did I just say?
Yeah,
Was that
exactly. I
um
understand too. Once I get to know somebody, I can usually do that pretty well as far as allow myself to talk from that place without sounding crazy.
sure.
Because if you start rattling off all kinds of strange things, whole point is to learn how people accept what you say or how they what type of information they're looking for on the art side of life.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can really go deep on the art field if you want. There's lots of places to go with the creative side of life. I mean,
Yeah.
you can deal with things you make and create with your hands and mind, or you can deal with life itself
Mhm.
and everything around you.
So you've done really incredible. Looked at the gold sword earlier. Collaboration with Delana. I or Delana, sorry. God damn
Yeah.
it. um and but I've also seen you use steel of make do you make your own Damascus? I've seen you work with like Jay Morrissey's steel.
Right.
You and I have actually talked at length regarding trying to get some steel to you as well, for some collaboration work. And I'm curious, like, what's your kind of perspective on Damascus and making your own Damascus or working with other people's Damascus, and what's that process like for you?
I always made all of my own steel up until, oh, just not that long ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago. I
Oh,
started
okay,
using other people's steel occasionally too,
sure,
especially patterns I like.
yeah,
Jason did some killer stuff, and that was just something new and different, and I wanted to see what we could do with that. So sending a
hmm
bunch of actually 203E and W2 and had him do some patterning in that because
oh
203E and
wow,
W2 for me at 320 or plus layers allows me to get some nice coloration in what I like to look for in bluing processes or turning things black and silver and all that.
right,
And the bluing process I like to do is I like to have things that really stand out in multi-colors that nobody else does.
hmm
And you just don't see it. I mean, like the pieces you have on there now, those are just shop photos, but the colors in there are gold, pink, and jet black, flat black.
right,
And so that happens by understanding the alloys that you're using and what times to leave the material in the bluing salts.
right,
And what happens with those pieces, if you notice, the pink is through the blade, but it's also the entire liners are pink to match. My whole point there was
oh
actually
yeah,
matching the titanium because
right,
I put titanium liners on those and I anodized the titanium to the pink and I matched the blade color. And I did that purposely because it looks really cool. It gives you that flash of black and pink on the handle and black and
right,
pink on the blade.
yeah,
And it worked out quite well. But I like multicolored pieces in blades. Not all the things that way. I don't do
sure.
it on everything, but there are unique pieces. And Jason's steel lent itself to being done with those colors that way. Those two pieces there are Jason Morrissey.
Yeah. Are the steel combination in this on these blades, is that the W2 and
203E, correct.
203E? I've
Yeah,
never heard of 203E.
it's just a high nickel steel. It's just
Okay,
not it's just a super high nickel, and it works great for the coloring that I do on the types of pieces that I make for those.
Sure.
Most of the time, the pieces that we make like that, we really stick to one pattern. We stick to ladder pattern. We like ladder. We still do it the
Yeah.
old traditional way of grinding out the grooves and hand
Oh, wow.
flattening. Yeah.
Dang. Well, you're
Well, there's
doing
a
some
visual.
creative ladders.
Well, there's a visual you get
Yeah.
with ladder that's pressed in versus ladder that's ground out. There's a
Right.
in the visual, and it's just the way it works.
Yeah.
Uh, there's a chatoyance in the look when you look at it, that you get this iridescence in it when it's ground out versus what happens when it's pressed in.
Yeah.
And
That's interesting. I agree, actually.
yeah,
Um,
there's a difference in the visual. I've always that, and I mean, I like it the other way. There is
sure.
a depth that you get by grinding the grooves out. What happens is that when you hammer or press that back down, and we like to use a hammer, because what happens is that I always call it overhammering,
Oh,
because
sure.
when I'm flattening out the ladder billet,
Yep.
when you're compressing that with the hammer, what happens is you're squashing those internal parts even tighter when you're flattening out after you've ground those grooves.
Mhm.
And it gives you that real super tight pattern in between the more bold pattern of your ladder. And that's what
Right.
gives you that iridescent look.
Yeah.
It's real hard to focus on it, actually. When it's done right and you get a beautiful piece of steel, you can look at it and it looks blurry almost. It's such a beautiful pattern on
Mm.
it. There's a carved ivory dagger, if you could see in person. But the problem in photographs, you can't pick any of that up in a photo.
Okay.
You yourself know that. You can never see that in a photograph. You can't see the iridescence in a photograph. So those ladders, like that one, that has an unbelievable iridescent look to that blade. You can
Oh,
see the
sure.
little dark lines running down through it.
Sure.
But yeah, that's just, those types of ladders are just killer. I just love that, because you run that up and down with light on it, and the focus, it looks like it's from another world. I really like that.
Yeah, well, and I think part of when you're cutting the ladder, versus pressing it, like, you are physically removing material. There seems like a no duh, but you have, I think, a little bit more control over kind of the depth through which you're cutting into that bar, because I think the hard thing that people struggle with is realizing that what you're seeing is a partial cross section of that material that then gets pushed up to the surface. And by cutting away the material versus pressing it, you really are just shearing straight through those layers. And then you're pushing them up to the surface when you reduce it down and flatten it again, versus pressing, especially if you haven't done anything to kind of crown the ladders or change the ladders. If they're very flat, and then it's a sharp shoulder, and then it's a flat, and then it's a sharp shoulder and flat, you just don't get the same activity.
No,
You just
no, you
don't.
don't. It's still a nice, beautiful pattern. Don't get me
Right.
wrong. But what
Yeah,
happens is
absolutely.
that when you press in, you have to surface ground down to that to get your billet out of the middle of that, and you end up surface grounding a larger area that has a more bolder ladder pattern. So you broaden the pattern and you don't
Mhm.
condense it. To me, by grinding the grooves in and pressing or hammering, I always liked hammering, you compress those small areas in between. So you get those little tiny fine lined areas in between, which give you that essence that you're looking for.
Absolutely. And you've also, at least I'm sure you've mentored lots of people, but I know Mark Bartlett has been a big fan of yours, and I've talked to him off and on over the years, and actually, I was vaguely aware of your work, and I'd seen it through just doing image searches of knives and folder knives, and I've seen them lots of times. But it was in talking with Mark Bartlett to better get, um, a better understanding of you as a maker, and all the kind things he had to say about you. What has it been like for you to be a mentor to makers like Mark, as they develop kind of their own voice and process and techniques? And because he's doing a lot of, he's done some folding daggers, he's done some very elaborate, kind of locking box mechanisms for, like, kind of revealing the knife. And I'd be curious what your take is on kind of being that, almost like, yeah, like a mentor role model for people in that way.
Yeah, that's a odd thing. Yeah, but Mark's cool. He's got his own thought process, and he creates and
Sure.
designs his own pieces. But he has been here a few times, and Really, the times he's been here, Delena's probably shown him more than I've been able to, because most of the time I get sidetracked on all kinds of other thought processes.
Sure.
But the what I try to do, and it's what makes it hard trying to share information. I have no desire to teach someone how I do things. I would much rather teach somebody why I do things. By teaching someone why, it allows me to share with them why I did this. And when you do that, then they understand the why, and they can do it their own way with the tools and equipment they have. They don't have to buy anything special or have any different type of tool or anything like that. I design and do things around any of the equipment that I have. I've learned to work with what small amount of tools that I have, and I do everything I do with those tools. And if I can teach people why I do things, so which is, depending on how far people want to go, then you start getting into the emotional or visual stimuli of the creation of why you're doing this. You're doing this so that this light, this shadow, this depth, all this works for this reason, versus just I'm grading this because it needs to, rather than file it, or I'm filing this because I'd rather file it than grind it. It's different. I like to say that everything has a reason for being.
So it's kind of like technique versus philosophy or theory.
Exactly. Kind of both, actually. You're putting technique in that works with philosophy, why and how you do certain. My whole goal in life was never to create clones of myself. I never wanted that. I like to share the emotional side of it and teach people how to use their own creative energy that they have within themselves, versus trying to use mine to. It doesn't. I mean, it's fine to do that. It bothers me. It's that I really want people to use their own creative energy, because without innovation and creativity, the future's bleak in this type of an industry. People need to innovate. People need to be creative. If you start doing things one set way, then before long, everybody's doing that one thing over and over and over, and nobody has any ability to creative think anymore. And all of a sudden, innovation stops, and all these new ideas stop. And then, but out of the blue, somebody comes in and says, "Oh, wow, look what I did." And then something new happens, and people start trying to get creative again, hopefully. The whole point is to share creative energy and have innovation for longevity of this industry. You can't survive makers long. Everything's going to look, and you can't have that.
When I first started my own knife making path in 2012, 13, everybody was doing feather patterns, like everybody. And at first I was like, wow, that's really cool. But then I just kept seeing it over and over and over again. I'm like, well, that kind of killed my interest and desire to make feathers. But then I started thinking, based on the equipment and tools that I have, I was like, well, how could I create a feather pattern effect that has somewhat of a similar aesthetic, but definitely has a different kind of way the pattern presents. And I actually have come up with a way of welding steel together to create a feather effect without feather cutting, because I don't have a hot cut for making feathers. I could easily make one, but I'm actually more interested in kind of like the problem solving aspect of figuring out how to create a similar effect without actually doing the same process. And by problem solving that from a different perspective, I'm also figuring out different processes for making other interesting patterns at the same time. And I've done the feather, the faux feather is what I call it, once, and then that was it. I was like, but what I've done is I've taken that approach and I've implemented it with other patterns that don't necessarily have the feather look, but the way that the pattern meets and comes together is very unusual. And it's because of that process of trying to figure out how to make a feather without feathering, I've created a whole different approach to making patterns that is very unusual, but still interesting visually.
Yeah, it's cool that you can use critical thinking that way. That's the key thing to everything in innovation is critical thinking. Being able to look at what you need and say, that's the only way I can do that. So I've got to buy
Mm,
this and I got to buy that and I got to have this tool and I got to have that tool. And the whole point is, no, for me, I could never afford that tool anyway. So I would be like, okay, I'm going to
yeah,
try to get that effect, but I'll do it this way.
right.
And you try this and you do this and you develop these entirely new ways. And what happens is you end up coming up with an innovative process that's all you.
Yeah,
And you individualize your own product, trying to do something similar to something else, but because you don't have the same tooling and the same ability as far as tools and those types of things with that type of technique, you develop an entirely new process, which is really cool because it opens itself up to where all of a sudden your innovativeness has created a total new place for you in the market. And that's a
sure.
cool thing.
Yeah, and it's I never really thought about it from that perspective that by kind of troubleshooting and critical thinking around a problem and or in a process, um, it just by virtue of limitation of your own tooling, maybe you create a new process, and even though it may have a similar appearance, it is uniquely yours because of your skill base, and technique base, but also just your limitations of tools. But you're still creating a similar or kind of your own approach to creating that same kind of aesthetic. But those small, minute details is what makes it uniquely yours. And I think I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, that's exactly true though. And that's what needs to be shared more of. That's what I try to get people to do. That's the
Yeah,
whole point is to not show people how to do it, but to show like learning that, I do certain things a specific way for a specific reason. But you can achieve the same thought process, you can achieve the same end product in an entirely
right,
different way
right,
with what you have. I mean, if you want to have an effect on something, you will find a way to do it with what you have to do it with.
sure,
There's no way around that in the knife industry, especially.
yeah,
Uh, you'll do things differently, but you'll have desired results that'll make you feel good inside yourself, which is the most important thing. You're wanting to achieve something for your own personal reasons. It just
yeah.
makes you feel
Your
good.
own, yeah, your own personal enrichment, and it's that creative expression, instead of following a recipe necessary to the T or a process necessarily to a T. You've kind of put your own little tweak on it. Um, and you've
Shows.
again, yeah, that problem solving and troubleshooting because simply because you may be missing even just one little tool that makes a difference, and you find a way to still get it done. There's that also that kind of like that gratification of like accomplishment. I did that thing. I fixed it, or I figured out a way. You found a
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that's my whole thought process has been that way my whole life. I've had to
Mm,
figure out new ways of doing things, mainly because early on I had trouble learning normal mathematics, so I taught myself my own math, and
mm,
I learned to go through life doing my own mathematics my own way in my own mind process, and it works great for me,
sure.
and it gets me all the answers I need to any problem I ever need. But it's an entirely new way of doing math, and,
Oh wow.
and I learned that when I was real little, and I started doing things differently because my mind thinks differently, and
Right.
having that, like I said earlier, it can be an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage. And so I started out at a very young age learning how to do things with what I had. And to me, this was the mind I had. So this is how I have to learn to do things. It's
Mm,
like these are the tools I have. So I
right.
have to learn to do it this way. There's no other way
Yeah.
around it. You just go with what you got and you achieve it to get your best results you can possibly do.
Sure.
And the other part that you do is you create things that are as good as you can do at the time. They don't
Mm,
have to be better, they have to be as good as you can do at this time.
sure.
Then they will always get better because then you'll notice over time that your good as has gotten much better than good as was 2 years ago.
Sure.
And it
Absolutely.
changes over time.
Do you I this is something I struggle with, and I'd be curious what your perspective is on kind of perfectionism. And is that thing that you struggle with? I mean, it sounds like you kind of create space for things to not be perfect by kind of using that mantra of this is the best I can do at this time, and kind of allowing yourself room to continue to progress and grow as a maker and as a creative person. Um, what is your take on perfectionism?
Personally, I design things that are imperfect on purpose, I think,
Mm,
because it actually helps. Um, that's why I don't stress over making elaborate drawings, sketches, or anything else like that.
okay,
Because if I do that, it sets me to a perimeter. I get stuck within these lines,
you're
and
in a box.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've basically painted myself into a circle. And the whole point is, like the good old saying goes, is you have to think outside the box.
Mm.
Well, to me, I like to build the box. That's the thought process.
Right.
That way, you don't have to worry about it. You are it. You
You can
become
yeah,
that.
you build the box, you can play wherever you want inside of it.
Exactly. And you
That's
can
such
be
a good
in it or
I love
without
that.
it. And that's the whole process of that. So
Mm,
you design things that are imperfect, and then you allow yourself to make them better as you create them. So as you're making the piece, you build it as good as you can at the time. And if your sketches look like hell, like a lot of mine do, then you're like, wow, because this came out really cool. And it takes a lot of time. And the more time you put into something, actually, you'll get at it. Now there are reasons, or there's not reasons. There is a version of that is not good. Is that sometimes it can take you a very long time to do something, and you need to eat and pay bills. So you
right.
have to look at the in between, and that may be a process where you end up working on a couple things at the same time.
Sure.
Um, Personally, there is no route to perfection, and there is no such thing as perfection. It can be called perfect and looked at perfect from the outside
Mm,
perspective. Someone else can see and say that. Within the artist, you'll know it's never that way because
sure.
it can't be. It's not the way creative energy works. It doesn't allow you to be perfect. It allows you to try. It allows you to try to achieve, which seems to be what keeps people going. I don't look for perfection. I look for, again, emotion.
Mm,
I like to
mm,
share a visual and make it an emotional experience that I'm sharing part of myself in what I make. And there's only so much of me left to do that with.
mm,
You only have so many pieces of art in you.
sure.
And that's the way any artist is. And you're limited to how much you can put into each piece you create because each one takes a lot out of you.
Yeah.
As hard as it is for people to think like that, it's the truth. When you do things that require an enormous amount of time, it's not just the time you're putting in. It's not anything to do with labor. It has to do with sharing part of yourself, your life essence, your creative energies going into that piece, and you're sharing that with the outside world. That's what
Yeah.
they're feeling. For me, I look at it as it's a way of achieving immortality. What you're doing is you're creating bits and pieces of you that will live on forever.
Mhm.
By taking the time to do the type of work you do, you know it's going to be there forever. It's not something somebody's going to throw in a drawer and quit using. It's nothing like that. These pieces people will have on display in a museum somewhere forever. And they'll always be there. And your name will always be on it, hundreds of years after you're dead and gone.
Sure.
And to me, that's a way of achieving that type of thing is knowing that you're sharing part of yourself from now on. That's the fun part about creative energy and art itself
Mm.
is
It's like a creative form because there's like it, when you when I think of self-preservation, I think of the very basic of like shelter, community, or being able to just get food, and stuff like that. But it's almost kind of uh, art and creativity is another form of self-preservation in the way that it can potentially last, yeah, like you said, hundreds of years. Well, I mean, we're still finding artifacts from thousands of years ago, and people, you know, somebody took the time and the effort and the energy to develop the skills to make that particular thing. Um, and
Exactly.
it's yeah, it's interesting that it's creativity is another form, kind of in a way, another form of self-preservation. Um, but again, I mean, obviously, different people have different reasons for pursuing that. I think mine still is kind of in line with just to make, because ultimately I'm making tools, right? I'm making tools that are very highly embellished.
Exactly.
Um, and it, it goes at a certain point, it stops being a tool, I think. I mean, it still is still a tool, but once I've gone beyond the point of the actual like form and function of that tool to embellish it in particular sculpting shapes or particular materials, um, started to become an art piece, and through that expression it inspired, like, it sounds funny to say like I'm inspiring somebody to cut onions or something like that, but I get messages all the time of how much pleasure and enjoyment that people get from using the tools that I make, um just because of the performance, but just like how they feel using it. um and yeah,
That's a
it's
key
powerful
thing to
to
have.
show that. Yeah.
It makes you feel good inside when you get that back too,
Yeah.
because people are taking art and actually using it. There are people who use Delena's folding. Remember that from years ago? Took them
Yeah.
out in the garden and cut up things, and it's a fascinating process because it's all artwork has an illusion and a feeling, or a feeling, either way.
Hmm.
But good artwork has both, and there's
Yeah.
a key there. And it's very important to have both. It has to have an illusion and a feeling. The illusion is that it 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 takes people places in their mind. It makes people say what
Mm.
they say to you when they talk about how they feel when they cut things with this, because it's such a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
They've went somewhere in their mind with that, and most times they'll never tell you where they went,
Sure.
but they did, because it made them feel that way. It made their imagination go places. It made them, even if they're just showing it off in front of their friends while they're cutting up things during a holiday, that makes them feel wonderful inside. And
Right.
you've been able to make that feeling happen, and they appreciate that from you. And that's the most important thing to remember, is that you're creating things for other people, and you're sharing a part of you with other people to make other people happy.
Yeah.
And that's how I share emotions with people, is through art. I
Sure.
don't actually, due to the way my brain thinks, I don't have the ability to share emotions in other ways that most people
Sure.
do. And that's how I do it. It's through everything you create. You want people to feel something in everything you make. So for me, being ordinary, I didn't want to be ordinary. I wanted to have extraordinary feelings and emotions. And I wanted to make these things that people can feel, touch, and relate to and experience in such a way that they go off on some little story in their mind, and it's all their own experience. All I'm doing is, like I've said before, is creating a conduit. I am the conduit. I
Hmm.
take you between here and there. It's just like the author of a book takes you on a path.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's exactly what you do with any form of art. Written stories are the same way. The books are like that.
Yeah.
It's a form of art. A painting is the same way. A sculpture, everything is the same way. It's all line and shape, vibrational energy, and created harmony. It all works together. Long as you know how to take lines and shapes and make them work in harmony, you create art that becomes acceptable to the public and
Mm.
desirable. And there is a difference. There's a difference between something that harmonizes within itself and something that doesn't. And you'll know it if you make it that it's not right, because people will see it. And like I said earlier, it's the most important thing to me, is for someone to look at a piece and say it's a beautiful piece, or the dreaded, "Oh, that's nice steel," or the dreaded, "Oh, that's a nice pearl on the handle," or "That's nice file work you did there." But never say that's a beautiful piece. That
Mm.
lets you know something didn't work. It was always the dreaded nice steel adjuster. We used to have a joke about that in the '90s and
Mm.
early 2000s. It shows a bunch of the guys and going around, and you walk up to one of their tables and look at their piece, and you say, "Ah, nice steel." Look,
They didn't
tell
have anything else to say about the rest of the knife.
that's it. Because you'd always didn't like, and everybody knew it. It was an ongoing thing. You wouldn't say nice knife, you'd say nice steel. And everybody's like, oh, what's wrong with my knife, man?
Right.
Yeah, it's a fun
That's fun.
process.
I've had such a great time chatting with you, and just hearing you talk, I'm like, I want a book of like Van's philosophy on art and craft or something like that. And it being kind of like your story as well, and your and the things that have gotten you to where you've developed this style, and you've been able to identify, what works and what doesn't. Do you think, I mean, to step into that, you were saying, to be able to do those, like, to figure out how lines work, like, what would you say is the best way to kind of develop that sense? Is it just from trial and error? Is it from is it maybe from modeling off of things that, or works that, that have that sense of balance and that flow, um, and then developing kind of your own tech and like approach and style? Or, how does one come to understand kind of like the combination, the symphony of vibration and lines and contours that you're talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's a hard one too. It's a hard one to explain. I started off everywhere I would go and walk around and travel, even in like, you have to comparatively think about things. Most people look at things literally, and they'll look
Mm,
at shapes and lines literally. So they'll see, oh, there's a curve, there's a straight line, and there's a curve. Now there's a so many degree curve, and there's a so many degree curve, and when you start getting into that type of detail, it makes things very difficult because then you're starting to line up numbers and times and specific formulas and everything else. I look at lines and shapes. I mean, it's like walking through Home Depot and looking at things along the aisle and thinking about how many different things you can make out of that one thing that's meant for one thing.
mm,
There's something there that's meant to do one thing with, but you look at it and you think, wow, I could make 27 other things out of that one thing.
right.
And it gives you all these ideas to deal with that one thing in its own shape and form. So then you start doing that, and it gets your imagination going. What happens is it gets your creative thoughts going. You just
Mm,
automatically think. So it comes from building things like in your shop. If you need a tool, but you can't afford to buy the tool, then you go to a store and you start looking for all these different pieces and parts because you don't know what that part is called. You get this thing that's shaped like that and this thing that's shaped like that, and you make these things go together and become this thing. It all works the same way. I know it's hard to explain, but it is that way. It's like outside, I look at the shapes of trees and how those lines all flow. And if you look at especially in the fall, look at the tree limbs with no leaves on them and see all the different
mm,
lines in different directions
yeah.
and how you can big pieces of that and make it into different things. Thing, it's that how would you go about that? Oh, how would I explain how, how to actually do the symphony of line and shape? It,
Yeah.
it's the thing I can do. You feel it. It's a test. Is something here and look at it from that point of view. You'll feel the connected shape, form,
Sure.
the energy. You know, as far as how that only thing I can is me. Everything is lines and it sounds simple to tell people is it is, but I just a little bit seeing it from my point of view would be difficult. But
Yeah.
sharing that everything is harmony, every line. So you have straight lines, curved lines, they all have a vibration when they're put together, and when they work in one continuous flowing piece, it all works. You know how that works. You've designed things that feel good to your eye and your mind and your hand and the flowing line and shape. So I guess that would be where some of these techniques that people use with codes and things to
Mm,
figure out lines and shapes may work in those processes. I don't know.
sure. I think Symphony of Line and Shapes is the name of your book.
Yeah, that's it.
That's
Symphony of
it.
line and shape. Once I get going, it makes it fun to talk. I've got
Sure.
hundreds of pages of things I have written, but I haven't published anything.
Mm,
It takes me a little while getting to know. I mean, today is the first time I've ever been on a podcast, so it's a little difficult to learn that and get over the nervousness of that. And I just
sure.
met
I
you,
feel you.
a couple hours ago, my first
Right.
time in my entire life, and it's a it's a whole different thing
Yeah.
to come on somewhere and know that you're talking to a bunch of people live, and you have to remember everything you're saying and not make yourself look like a total idiot. And
It's part of the, allowing your self room for improvement. I make an idiot out of myself all the time.
yeah, I've spent most of my life doing the same thing. I mean,
Yeah. Well, we do have I can't think of any other questions that I wanted to ask you, but we do have a question over on our Patreon that I wanted to jump in and make sure, um, that we got to. Oh, actually, Ben had one more question in the live chat, and he says, in reference to one of the time machine pieces, but he says, "Does the aperture open and close with the blade?"
no,
Um,
no,
okay, and
it's
I think it
separate.
was in reference of this.
Yeah, yeah. The iris is over the guard pieces. Could never do that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I can never justify how hard somebody will open and close a knife. And when you're working with tiny
Mm,
gears, that's why
yeah.
none of the gears turn with the blade opening and closing either. The gears all turn separately internally, and you do them all by hand manipulation, and they all move. Everything moves. The irises open and close. All the gears turn. But hooking it up to the blade, what happens is you create a problem future. So someday you're going to have to repair and take that all back apart and fix it and maybe do it multiple times.
Oh my god.
And you
Yeah.
don't really want to do that because when you're working on tiny gear structures like that, it's so easy for someone to try to close something too quickly and immediately strip something out. And then that means
Oh,
rebuilding
jeez.
the whole entire piece over and over and over
Right.
again.
I got you.
So as cool as it sounds to do it that way, yeah, I would love to have done it and could have easily done that, but it would not have had any longevity. And when you spend, a month and a half building something or 2 months building something, you don't want to have to rebuild it over and over for free after that.
No.
And so you have to design around that aspect. There's lots
Mhm.
of things I would love to do to pieces that are cool. I mean, that's a functioning piston on the back of that. That's a real coil spring, internal
Oh,
coil
yeah.
spring piston.
Okay.
But I couldn't. There's a lot of things you can't do
Right.
because you have to think about longevity. And first of all, certain
Well, it's
things
keeping that functionality, the actual physical functionality of that thing in mind, which I think is important,
yeah,
like we've been
absolutely.
discussing. Yeah.
And also that knife opens like glass. It's just absolutely.
Oh,
I've
nice.
done. I actually did videos of that because when I pushed the button on that to unlock the blade, it almost closes on its own. Actually, people think it does close on its own, but it doesn't. It's how smooth it is. There's no they're non-friction mechanisms, so
Oh, wow.
everything there's no touch. The lock mechanism on that only touches for about 10 thousandths of an inch, so that's it. So everything else is free floating. And when you get free floating, it allows you to adjust your pivot area so you can really make things super smooth. Pretty
Where
cool.
can Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask where people could find, um, the video of you
Uh,
showing how that mechanism works
Probably on Instagram. You'd have to go
on
to my
Instagram.
page and
Okay.
scroll down. I'm pretty sure there's a video there of opening and closing. Actually, probably that time machine or one close to it.
Yeah.
None of them were identical, but they were all a little bit different.
And on Instagram, just real quick for people, it's VAN Barnett Barnett.
Correct.
Okay. And then, all right, so we got questions on the Patreon. First one is from 66 Mountain Knives. He says, I wish I had some kind of thoughtful question for the interview, but his work is so meticulous that I can't even comprehend how his mind must work. So hopefully this conversation has helped help Dan to understand how your mind works a bit. Um, So he's mostly, I guess it's less of a question and more of a compliment. So
Well,
I
hope,
appreciate Dan for
yeah.
sharing that.
Hopefully, I think thanks a lot. Hopefully, it helps people think a little differently because I'm really not an asshole. I'm just a very different human being, and it's very difficult for me. I don't have friends, and it's just the way life works, you know. But
Mm,
I love sharing information and doing things. It's hard to do.
sure. And then Benjamin Butcher has another question on here. He says, "Is there a single piece of advice you would give to an aspiring artisan?" And again, I think we've covered a lot of actually honestly great advice. Um, but is there anything in particular that really stands out if you could only tell somebody one thing?
I would use one of my quoted sayings I like to say a lot, which is the doors to your future can only be opened with the keys that you forge in the fires of your mind.
Mm,
And that's just the way it is.
right.
Um, Everything has to have part of you within it. So if you create those keys, you're the one that can go forward within your own future. Sharing part of you within everything you make is the most important thing in art. It's more than just a flashy object with something on the surface.
Sure.
It's something that's part of you. And if you remember that you're sharing part of yourself from now on with everything you make, no matter what it is, it actually makes you put a little more of you into it because that's how your success will happen in anything you do like that
Right.
is when people see you in it. And it's just sharing part of yourself is the most important situation for people, and turning emotions into physical objects is the big thing. That's what most artists do. um, Everything is a representation of internal emotion meant to create feelings for observers and patrons and people like that, whether it's written words, paintings, anything like that.
Yeah.
Sculptures, all of it is all forms of sharing emotions, and that's just the way it is, at least to me.
Yeah. Um, so beyond being a knife maker, you're also a sculptor. You're also a poet. Um, and I feel like so much you've said has been pretty poetic, honestly. Um, but I was wondering if there's something that we could kind of close out this conversation with that you think would be relevant in regard to like art and craft and the endeavor of knife making or creative expression, that you'd like to share.
The endeavor of art, huh? the it's 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 not something that is uh, easily, how can I say this? What accomplished? I guess. Yeah, it's a learning process. Knife making
Mhm.
itself, turning knife making into an art form yourself. Everyone does that already. Everyone who makes knives is already creating art with their hands, and they're already
Mhm.
using their minds to create it. Also, I guess to be successful is to go back on to some of the things we said earlier, which is to be yourself and make sure you always show part of yourself within everything you make.
Oh,
Um,
whoops. Sorry. Actually, I just realized, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you. Can I get you to pop your camera back up so we can finish with your face as
okay,
part of the stream? Because I think what you're saying is very powerful. And there you are. Okay.
being you are, it's a very important. Be yourself and share yourself and all. No matter what type of knife you make, it doesn't matter. You're being an artist when you're making that because you're using energy.
Mhm.
That energy is form energy, so to tapped into that. That's who you are. That's your expression. Life. Everything is you and your own individual thought process.
Sure.
Put part of that in you make. It's really that simple. It's people think, well, that's complicated. Actually, no, it's hard. So own, you know, do what you talked about. Do that little extra thing of developed your own style of doing it. Well, you did it because you actually had to. You didn't have thing to do that, but you did it your way with your tools, your equipment, and
Yeah.
that's the easiest. Is base it on what tool equipment you have. I don't people. I don't care. It used to be a big thing about people
Right.
using CNC mills. I don't give a shit. As long as that's
Right.
behind. It's all part of the innovative, creative process. Everything to continue this type of product making industry itself. It's
Mm.
for this industry to go on, and it's innovation and creative thought processes to keep it going. And we all have to be involved in doing that. Even if it's just sharing with people why things versus how.
Sure.
That does help because it
Yeah.
allows all parts of the industry to flow forward through the art side of it and the functional side and everything all together. It's all supposed to be that way. I've really not said anything here, but it sounded good anyway.
No, it's perfect. I think that's a very good note for us to end on. Van, thank you so incredibly much for taking the time. We're at just over 3 hours of conversation, and
Wow.
I know I got a lot of of takeaways from this chat with you, and I hope others are getting value from this conversation. I think you have a really great perspective in regard to the art of the craft, and it's I think it's really important. I think what's great that hopefully a lot of people see this to kind of gain some of that understanding of you and your perspective on making, because I think it's very relatable and valuable, and just I think a good way of looking at it, especially from a more artful perspective. There's always gonna not everybody's in it for that, but for those who
I
are,
agree.
this conversation has been a very, for me personally, has been a very good way to kind of frame and better understand kind of even my own ways of thinking things, because I sometimes it's hard to define even your own thought process or why certain things jump out at you and feel right. And I think some of the ways you've described them really helped me to kind of put them into words. And I think everybody who's been in the live chat, jumping in. Ben and Mike have been here throughout the whole thing, I think, where there were every once in a while there are extra people jumping in. But I appreciate you guys. I appreciate the super sponsors. I'll just rail through them real quick. Again, it's at Maritime Knife Supply. All these people you can find on Instagram. So it's at Maritime Knife Supply, Ben Butcher at Amo Bladesmithing, Gabe Fletcher at Anchorage Forge, Tony Sasma at TNT Forge, Brian Hinnenkamp at Tortuga Blade Works, Eric Kidwell at District 202 LLC, Josh Weston at Josh A. Weston. Michael Poor is at Red Dragon Forge. Russell Tinsley is at Can't Make Knives. And Dan Hubbs is at 66 Mountain Knives. I just want to be clear. It's the actual numbers and not the words 66. So 66 Mountain Knives. And if you want to become part of this conversation, these live chats, and to be able to have the opportunity to talk to people like Van with such a depth of understanding and a kind of a very strong and philosophical kind of approach to creativity, you can go join in at the Patreon, at the illuminated individual level. So that allows you to kind of catch these conversations live. Adrian was in here too. Thanks, Adrian. Catch these conversations live. Be able to become part of the conversation, ask these questions directly to these people, because it's very rare that you get the opportunity to chat with makers of such high levels with such a depth of experience and understanding, that really help you to progress in your path and your journey as a maker, and a creative person. And again, I just want to thank you, uh, Mr. Van Barnett, for coming in and spending all this time chatting with me. It's been a pleasure getting to know you better. I look forward to hopefully meeting you someday soon, and especially with hopefully doing some work with you, to collaborate on some pattern stuff and some knife stuff. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah, that would be great. I really appreciate you having me. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. It's taken me what 3 hours to get used to you, so I will be able to open up a little more next time if we do this
Absolutely.
again.
I would love
It
to have you back.
it takes me a little while to get to know someone before I can allow myself to go into these other places, but there's a lot of stuff to discuss still yet,
Sure.
and it could be good in the future. We'll see what happens.
Yeah,
But thank
I
you
think
so
that'd be
much for
great.
having me on here.
Absolutely. No, it really was my pleasure. I appreciate you.
It was good first time. I've never done a podcast before, so this is the first. I'm set up. I've been set up to do them for a long time. I've just never done one.
We did it.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
You're just
I'm not a
chatting.
virgin anymore.
No, I took your
Oh,
virginity.
yes, absolutely. Yes, you did.
Yeah, it's just talking. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in the live stream. Thank you again to Dan or to Van, and thank you everybody who helps support the Patreon to make this podcast possible. And that's it. Cheers, everybody. Take care.